Sunny was pretty sure that his shadow was capable of much more than just being a silent follower. After all, the spell had described it as being an invaluable helper. It was now up to him to find out how exactly shadow control could be of help. As in many other matters having to do with aspects, there was a certain level of instinctual understanding buried deep inside his subconscious. This understanding was either given to him by the spell or was something innate to every awakened. Sunny just had to sense the subconscious knowledge and learn how to put it into practice. Once again, he concentrated on sensing his body and spirit, then commanded the shadow to perform a series of simple motions. With each of them, he was growing more and more familiar with the feeling of controlling the shadow. Pretty soon, it was as natural to him as breathing and walking. The shadow felt like a part of his body. Satisfied with this initial result, Sunny carefully gave it a new command. Without pause, the shadow separated itself from the soles of his shoes, walked to the other end of the room and turned around, staring at him in slightly mocking silence. Sunny was left without a shadow. This is not scientific at all, he thought with an amused smile. Science never really applied to anything having to do with the spell, after all. As the shadow walked away, he felt a very weird split happening in his mind. It was like his perception had separated into two distinct sources. One was his body, the other his shadow. With a bit of trying, he managed to focus on the second source. Instantly, his vision blurred. "Whoa!" Sunny blurted, surprised. "Whoa!" the shadow heard from the other end of the room. Sunny blinked. In his mind there now existed two pictures. One was of his room's door, with an indifferent shadow standing in front of it. The other was of a pale young man sitting on a chair, wide-eyed and bewildered. "That's me." He raised an arm and waved it in the air. Simultaneously, the pale young man raised and waved his. "I can perceive the world through my shadow. Child of shadows, attribute allowing him to see and move stealthily in the darkness, and shadow control, allowing him to send out a sneaky shadow as a scout." He was pretty much a perfect spy. A spy was someone who gathered information without exposing themselves to a lot of risk. A role like that suited Sunny's taste very much. Of course, spies were also able to strike from the shadows with deadly precision. Armed with information, they were masterful ambushers. With the prior knowledge of the opponent's weaknesses, their attacks were surgical and lethal. But any direct confrontation would mean putting himself in danger. So Sunny wasn't very keen on becoming an assassin. After all, his aspect still lacked the means of directly enhancing his combat performance. "Shall we test it?" He looked at the shadow and gave it a command. With an exaggerated sigh, the shadow bent down and nimbly slid under the door. Instantly, he could see both the room and the hallway outside. Sunny closed his eyes to focus on the picture projected from the shadow. Moving stealthily from one shadow to another, it glided down the hallway. With a bit of timing and consideration, his scout was practically invisible. Sunny passed by a couple of sleepers and listened in on their conversation. Not finding it very interesting, he continued forward. Finally, the shadow stopped at a corner. To its left were the elevators, to its right the way to the girls' dormitory. All sorts of provocative images immediately entered Sunny's head. "Oh my," he thought, blushing. Yes, with this ability, it was also very easy to fall into utter depravity. But no, he couldn't do it. Not because of some high moral principles. It's just that, with his reputation of a pervert, the chances of being asked if he had done something unbecoming were pretty high. So he needed the ability to honestly answer no. "So, I probably shouldn't, right?" "Right, of course you're right. Don't even think about it." Back in his room, Sunny sighed with a lot of regret. Then he directed his scout to hide in the shadow of a passing sleeper and followed him to the elevators. Some time later, Sunny's shadow was hiding in a corner of a large dojo. He was observing his fellow sleepers who, under the guidance of Instructor Rock, were going through the motions of the introductory combat class. Today was mainly dedicated to testing their general competency and abilities. After that, the sleepers were going to be separated into groups based on their level, such as novice, advanced, or expert, as well as their weapon of choice. Some would be assigned a personal tutor or paired together. Currently, sleepers were taking turns delivering their strongest punches to a wide plate attached to a special measuring machine. After each strike, the machine would display a number corresponding to the sleeper's physical strength. In theory, a machine like that was not hard to build. However, considering that many of sleepers had combat-oriented aspects that enhanced their might in a variety of ways, it was actually a marvel of engineering and durability. Their technique and training also affected the final result. Most people were getting numbers ranging from 10 to 14. It was considered a good result, something that only the most athletic people could reach. However, a lot of sleepers, obviously those with enhancing aspects, were able to achieve a score of 15 or even 16. I would probably get 10 or 11, Sunny thought, feeling a little bored. Then he suddenly perked up, noticing that it was turn for Nephis, the highest-rated sleeper of their batch, to strike the plate. The slender girl approached the machine and, without much preparation, delivered a sudden, crushing blow. Sunny wasn't very well versed in martial arts, but even he was impressed by the flawless economy and speed of her execution. She had a lot of training. Nephis was becoming more and more intriguing. What's her actual background? After a short pause, the machine displayed the result. 16. Sunny felt a bit disappointed. Not that impressive. I was expecting more. She was the proud bearer of a true name, after all. After that, only Castor remained. This time, Sunny couldn't even see the flying fist, it was just too fast. The machine trembled and took more time calculating. Finally, two numbers appeared, 21. Everyone gaped at the display, stunned. More than a few admiring looks were thrown at Castor, who simply bowed and took a step back. Instructor Rock smiled. Not bad. Now, we will move to sparring and evaluate your general level of training. I need 2 volunteers to begin. Nephis was the first to step forward and walk to the center of the ring. A couple of seconds later, a tall and extremely muscular sleeper followed and faced her. The rules are simple. Make your opponent's back touch the floor or throw them out of the ring. Use whatever abilities and techniques you find appropriate. Oh, the show is starting. Watching sleepers fight each other was not only entertaining, but could also provide Sunny with knowledge of their powers. Back in the room, he leaned forward and rested his chin on his palms. Go, Nephis. The tall guy attacked without wasting any time. His muscles bulged, threatening to tear the soft fabric of his white dabak. He advanced like an unstoppable mountain, sending a vicious kick flying. A second later, he was lying on the floor with a dumbstruck look on his face. Nephis didn't even change her stance. Instructor Rock gave her a cheerful look and grinned. Next, what followed could only be described as a massacre. One after another, Nephis managed to defeat almost every single sleeper present in the dojo. She didn't seem to be faster or stronger than them, but each time someone entered the ring to fight her, they would inevitably end up beaten and thrown to the ground. Sunny watched the process with a growing sense of amusement. However, at some point, even he felt a bit of unease. Nephis moved with the calm precision of a battle machine. Her technique was clean, graceful, and ruthless. No matter what type of attack was thrown at her, she was able to either predict or instantly react to it, then deflect and turn it against the attacker with the minimum amount of effort. It didn't matter whether her opponent was poor, rich, or a legacy. Everyone would end up dealt with in a matter of seconds. What's more, through the whole process, the composed expression on her face didn't even change once. It was like Nephis was made out of metal. Is she even human? Sunny thought, suddenly apprehensive. What was he going to do if this changing star were to end up as his enemy? The best course of action would be to run away. Or better yet, try not to antagonize her to begin with. After all, the sun was also a star, and shadows didn't mix well with sunlight. Finally, Castor was the last one remaining once again. However, he didn't seem to be perturbed by the miserable failure of every other sleeper. With a soft smile on his lips, the young man stepped into the ring. Castor and Nephis faced each other. Their eyes locked for a few seconds, and then Castor slightly bowed. Lady Nephis, please excuse me in advance. What is he going to? A moment later, Sunny opened his eyes in shock. It seemed like Castor suddenly ceased to exist. However, it was only an illusion. The truth was that he was just moving so fast that the human eye wasn't able to keep up with his movements. If it wasn't for the special properties of shadow sight, Sunny wouldn't have been able to perceive anything either. Even then, he only noticed a hazy blur streaking through the air. In a fraction of a second, Castor covered the distance between him and Nephis and delivered a devastating blow. However, despite his astonishing speed, she somehow managed to react in time, slightly turning her body to deflect the strike. But it still wasn't enough. Although Nephis had managed to avoid being hit squarely in her center of gravity, Castor's fist ended up connecting with her shoulder, sending the girl into a spin. Not wasting any time, Castor disappeared again. His plan was very simple. While Nephis was still under the impression that the enemy was in front of her, he was going to use his unnatural swiftness to circle around and attack from the back. The young man appeared behind the oblivious girl, ready to finish the fight with one decisive strike. Just as he planned, she seemed to be preparing to attack in the direction he had been seen just a split second ago. Gratified, Castor shifted his weight, putting it all into his fist. However, at the last moment, Nephis suddenly changed her stance and threw her elbow back with frightening force. Castor's eye widened. It was all a feint, and now that he had committed to a strike, there was no simple way to stop. No matter how fast he was still subject to the laws of inertia. The elbow was approaching his face with a profound feeling of inevitability, and yet Castor still managed to avoid it, even if it was just by a hair's breadth. His speed advantage was just too big. He then proceeded to trip and push Nephis, sending her flying to the ground. However, just before she was about to hit the mats, the young man carefully grabbed the collar of her dabak and gently pulled, slowing down the fall and allowing Nephis to land on the floor without any impact. Lying on her back, the girl blinked a couple of times and looked up at him. The whole altercation lasted no more than 2 seconds. Back in his room, Sunny opened his eyes in shock. So that's an ascended aspect. That's cheating. A sleeper had no business being that fast. The powers bestowed upon them by the spell were supposed to be in their infancy. But Castor was a legacy, after all, who knew how many soul shards were fed to him prior to enrolling into the academy. Back in the dojo, Instructor Rock grunted and gave Castor a nod. Nephis slowly rose to her feet. The rest of the sleepers were gawking at the young man with reverence, whispering among each other in hushed tones. It seemed that his performance left them with a deep impression. However, Castor himself wasn't very elated. He glanced at Nephis with an unreadable expression. That was because, unlike the rest of them, he came to a certain realization. The truth of the matter was known only to him, Nephis, Instructor Rock, and Sunny, who was very observant and quickly picked up on such things. The thing that sleepers failed to notice was that Nephis did not use her aspect ability when facing Castor. In fact, she had not used it at any point during today's testing. No one even knew what her ability was. And yet, despite his powerful aspect, Castor barely managed to clutch a victory against her. What a monster, Sunny thought, full of unease. The shadow hiding in the corner of the dojo seemed to agree with him wholeheartedly. After that, the introductory combat class was over. Sore from the beating they received, sleepers headed for the showers. Sunny waited for a bit, and then directed his shadow to sneak into the boys' locker room. He wasn't very interested in watching a bunch of teenagers changing clothes, but there was a slight possibility that Castor would either comment on his duel with Nephis, or answer some questions about his incredible aspect ability. Just as he had expected, the young man was surrounded by a group of newly converted fans. They were congratulating him on his victory, full of adoration and excitement. However, Castor himself seemed to be in a bad mood. His expression was somber, and there was a grim heaviness in his eyes. In fact, his face grew darker with each praise he received. "Castor, that was incredible. Your aspect is overpowered, am I right?" That Nephis girl stood no chance at all. True name, who needs that? She's just a wannabe. Finally, Castor raised his head and pierced the last boy who had spoken with a cold look. That boy, just like him, was one of the few legacies in their batch of sleepers. He frowned, surprised by Castor's reaction. "What is it?" Castor gritted his teeth. "I might have expected such behavior from them, but you should know better." The other legacy raised an eyebrow. "Why? Is there something special about that peasant girl?" Castor's eyes widened. Peasant girl. Do you really not know who she is?" "No," Sunny thought impatiently. "So just get to it and say it out loud." Luckily, the arrogant sleeper had the same sentiment. Castor opened his mouth several times, as though not sure what to say. Finally, he shook his head and answered, "She is Nephis of the Immortal Flame clan." As soon as he said that, the arrogant legacy became deathly pale. Not paying him any attention, Castor continued, "I trust that I don't need to tell you about her grandfather. Her parents were Smile of Heaven and Broken Sword." In his room, Sunny almost fell from the chair. Even he knew who Immortal Flame and Broken Sword were. The former was the first human to conquer the second nightmare and become a master. The latter, the first one to conquer the third nightmare and become a saint. They, as well as their companions, were among the most famous heroes of the human race. Someone who had managed to change history with their own two hands. If what Castor said was true, then Nephis wasn't just an aristocrat. She was royalty. No wonder he addressed her as lady. Why didn't he just call her princess instead? But that didn't make any sense. Echoing his thoughts, the pale-faced sleeper asked in trembling voice, "Then why? Why is she so?" Castor sighed, "Because they are all dead. The Immortal Flame clan is long gone." For a few moments the locker room was completely silent. Castor looked down. "She's the only one left." Late at night, when everyone was already asleep, Sunny furtively entered the dojo. Looking around, he made sure that no one was there, and then curiously approached the ring where Nephis and others had been tested earlier. He stopped at the center of the ring and stood there for a while, remembering how she had dealt with dozens of sleepers of their batch before being defeated by Castor. "Monsters, both of them are monsters," he mumbled, bitter and disheartened. Shaking his head, Sunny left the ring and then he looked at his shadow. "Do you agree?" The shadow hesitated for a few seconds, then stuck out its chest and crossed its arms, trying to appear cocky, disdainful and unperturbed. However, its act wasn't very convincing. "Yeah, you're right, exactly. What's the big deal anyway?" Both Immortal Flame and Broken Sword, Nephis' father and grandfather, were as monstrous in terms of power as one can get, but they still failed to protect their family from being eviscerated. So, power wasn't that important in the end. Even royalty was not safe from the cruelty of the world. Sunny sighed and proceeded to the measuring machine. Making a fist, he swung it and delivered his best punch. The machine hummed for a few seconds and then displayed a single number. 9. "Oh, come on. I deserve a 10 at least." Feeling very indignant, he struck the plate again, almost hurting his fingers. However, the result was the same. Damn it. Sunny paced for a bit, trying to control his anger. It seems he was destined to be a weakling. After all, the force of the strike depended on mass and acceleration. Acceleration could be improved with technique and exercise, but mass was something he had little control of. He was already done growing, and his height was not going to drastically increase in the future. No matter how hard Sunny trained, he was always going to be a lightweight. How is this fair? Suddenly filled with resentment, he punched the plate again, putting all of his frustration into this one strike. At that moment, a strange instinct suddenly awakened in Sunny's mind. Following the command of this instinct, his shadow flowed up and wrapped itself around his hand, sticking to it like a black glove. In the next moment, the punch connected. The machine trembled from the force of the strike. Sunny's yelped in pain and took a step back, cradling his bruised fist. After a while, the result was displayed. However, it wasn't a 9 anymore. It wasn't even a 10. It was 18. He looked at the displayed number for a long time, expressionless. Then a wide grin slowly appeared on Sunny's face. "I see. So that Y, of course." He clenched his fist again, looking down at the black, shadowy glove. "Ah, what an invaluable helper indeed. Now we're talking." Days flew by. Sunny only had 4 weeks to prepare himself for the journey into the dream realm, so there wasn't even a minute to spare. He was relentless, pushing his body and mind to the limits, in an attempt to absorb as much knowledge and skills as possible in that short amount of time. In the day, he studied with teacher Julius, slowly learning how to survive and take care of himself in the absence of civilization. Their lessons ranged from comparatively simple, like various ways to produce fire, to much more obscure and esoteric, like celestial navigation. What was so hard about celestial navigation? Well, as it turned out, the dream realm was not consistent in terms of star geography. Different regions had different stars and constellations, as well as a different number of moons. While the sun seemed to be the same, its behavior was highly unpredictable. Still, with sufficient knowledge, one could find ways to study the skies and subsequently navigate themselves. Most of these lessons were, supposedly, already included in the various school curriculums and known to the majority of sleepers. However, learning something from a textbook and learning the same thing from an actual awakened were two completely different matters. Teacher Julius had a habit of going much more in depth when explaining his subject. Thanks to this time-consuming habit of his, Sunny not only learned about the what, but also often gained glimpses into the why. This nascent understanding of the underlying principles of the dream realm environments gave him the ability to face any situation with at least some measure of readiness. Even the lessons in dead languages, which Sunny had initially judged to be useless, turned out to be much more interesting than he could ever imagine. This was, in large part, because it concerned the spell itself after all. The spell communicated with humans in one of those dead languages. By knowing the language, he was able to understand its various remarks and descriptions better. The simplest example of this was Nephis and her true name, Changing Star. While technically correct, this translation failed to properly convey the exact meaning. By understanding the grammatical structure of the rune language, it was easy to extrapolate and see that the more correct translation would have been Star of Change. More than that, there were different runes for change, each with its own connotation, depending on what exact rune was used to relay the meaning of the name. It could also mean ruinous star or star of misfortune. A small change in wording and connotation could mean a world of difference in real life. Sunny, who had never seriously studied before, found the process of acquiring vast amounts of theoretical knowledge strange, numbing, and exhausting. However, in a sense, it was also exhilarating. After all, knowledge was something that only the privileged had access to. It was also this authority over knowledge that kept them in the position of power, creating a vicious circle of inequality. The poor had no opportunity to study, and without the advantage of good education, they had no way to stop being poor. The weirdest part about all of this was that Sunny was now one of those privileged people. More than that, he was at the pinnacle of social hierarchy. Not only had he gained access to an unlimited amount of knowledge, but even his basic needs like food and shelter were also taken care of by the government, allowing him to fully focus on the single goal of developing himself as an awakened. This sudden transformation would have sent him into a whirlpool of philosophical reflection if he had any time to spare. But he didn't, because teacher Julius also insisted on holding practical lessons every other day, even if some of them had to be done in virtual reality simulations. He insisted on using the full immersion stations with enhanced physical feedback. As a result, Sunny was bone-tired and utterly exhausted. The good thing was that with such amount of exercise, coupled with his newly reforged body, Sunny had never been in better shape. Even without combat training, he could feel his strength, stamina, and agility improving by leaps and bounds. Basically, the peculiar rebirth he had experienced after completing the first nightmare had enhanced the innate potential of his body, bringing it to the peak of the human condition. However, it was up to him to realize that potential with sweat, effort, and a lot of hard work. Practical application of wilderness survival techniques provided him with the opportunity to do so. And as though this wasn't enough, Sunny secretly collected information about other sleepers and practiced shadow control every night. His shadow was independent enough to be sent on scouting missions without his direct control. It would sneak here and there, listening in on the conversations and observing different classes where sleepers had to demonstrate their aspect abilities. Then, after Sunny had finished his supper and returned to his room, it would come back and share everything it had heard and seen during the day. The only problem with this arrangement was that the shadow, despite its outward snarkiness, turned out to be rather naive. It didn't quite understand how the human world worked, and as such, often failed to distinguish between useful information and meaningless chatter. So, most of the time, Sunny would receive nothing of value or juicy gossip instead of important secrets. This is how he learned that in the sleeper center, romance was in the air. After all, there were 100 beautiful young people locked underground in close proximity to each other, with the added spice of a deathly threat hanging above their heads. Many felt that life was short, and it was their time to seize the day. Passion bloomed in the shadow of approaching danger. Sunny was excluded from this whole side of the thing, of course. Firstly, he had already positioned himself to be perceived as an unlikable lunatic. Secondly, he simply had no time for anything except for his lessons and training. And lastly, he was wary of getting too close to anybody, afraid that a situation would arise where he would have no choice but to divulge his true name. Apart from gathering information and slowly learning about the scope and details of various aspect abilities, and to a lesser extent, flaws, he was also experimenting with shadow control. The results were very promising. He quickly found out that his shadow was able to enhance various objects and not only his body. If it wrapped itself around a weapon, the weapon strike harder and deliver more damage. If it was applied to an armor, the armor would become sturdier and harder to break. The enhancement was rather substantial, too. It was roughly twice as much as the initial value. All in all, this ability, if used correctly, could make him a powerhouse among the sleepers. Many combat aspects could deliver more speed or damage. Many could provide more defense and protection, but none were as well-rounded and versatile as Shadow Slave. With the added utility of Shadow Sight, Shadow Step, and Shadow Scout, it was truly incredible. Just like that, day after day passed, slowly turning into weeks. Before Sunny even knew it, the winter solstice was already here. On the day of the winter solstice, Sunny woke up feeling tired and drowsy. No matter how much he tried to shake off this listlessness, it wouldn't go away. In the end, he just stayed in the bed for a while, wrapping himself in a blanket. He was already familiar with this feeling of never-ending, ensnaring sleepiness. It was the same in the days before his first nightmare. It was also quite similar to what he had experienced while slowly dying of hypothermia on the slopes of the Black Mountain. Remembering the cold embrace of approaching death, Sunny couldn't help but shiver. This was his last day on Earth, at least for a while. By nightfall, the spell was going to take him away once again, this time to challenge the vast expanse of the dream realm. What was he going to face in that ruined magical world? Would luck be on his side this time, or would there be another disaster? Ugh, there was no point in guessing. He had already done everything in his power to prepare for the inevitable. He studied hard, trained hard, and kept his secret safe. His aspect was better than most, and his will to survive was long tempered by the harsh reality of the outskirts and the even harsher ordeal of the first nightmare. All in all, he was ready. With a sigh, Sunny got out of bed and went along with his morning routine. If this was going to be his last hot shower in a long while, he was going to really enjoy it. If it was going to be his last scrumptious breakfast for the time being. Actually, he had no appetite. The cafeteria was full of sleepers, but no one was talking. Everybody was in low spirits and seemed to be uncharacteristically introspective. There was no usual laughter or boisterous conversations, only the legacies remained calm and collected. However, even they kept to themselves. Sunny thought about the last time he was preparing to enter the spell and, with a bit of trepidation, approached the coffee machine. During his stay in the academy, he had long discovered that a lot of people were in a habit of adding sugar and milk to their coffee. So on this auspicious day, he decided to give it another try. After all, it was nice to have a tradition. A few minutes later, he had taken his usual seat near Cassia, the blind girl. Despite their compulsory closeness, They had not talked to each other even once, just like two strangers forced to share the same space by circumstances beyond their control. Sunny did not see a reason for anything to change today. However, as soon as he took the first sip of coffee, Cassia suddenly turned her head and stared at him with her beautiful, blind blue eyes. Unnerved, Sunny looked around, checking if someone else had attracted her attention, and after making sure that there wasn't anyone standing behind him, asked, "W what?" Cassia was silent, as though hesitating if she should reply, and then suddenly said, "Happy birthday." "What?" Sunny frowned, trying to comprehend the meaning behind her words. Then a flash of surprise appeared on his face. "Oh right, it's my birthday today." He had completely forgotten about it. He was turning 17 today. Wait, how did she know about this? Sunny gave the blind girl a strange look, opened his mouth, and then decided to let the issue go. She was just too creepy. "Oh, thanks." With a nod, Cassia turned away and seemingly lost interest in having a conversation once again, which was for the better. Sunny returned to his coffee, finding it not too bad this time. Of course, sugar and cream were making most of the work. However, he did feel a little bit more awake after drinking it. 17, huh? Sunny was never sure that he would make it to this age alive. And yet, despite everything he did, life was sure unpredictable sometimes. If anyone would have told him a year ago that he was going to celebrate his 17th birthday by drinking real coffee with real milk and sugar, he would have laughed in their face. But now it was a reality. Unwillingly, Sunny remembered all the people who used to celebrate his birthdays with him a long time ago. Before his mood turned sour, he decisively dispelled these thoughts and forced himself to smile. "This is not bad. Let's do it again next year, when I'm already an awakened." Cheering himself up like that, he finished his coffee and left the cafeteria. There were no classes today, but he still visited the wilderness survival classroom and said his goodbyes to teacher Julius. The old man got pretty emotional when sending him off. He gave Sunny one last tip, a dozen or so times in a row, and even promised to apply for a research assistant position to be opened after the young man had become a full awakened. Sunny left thanking him for his time and patience. After that, there wasn't much to do. When the sun was close to setting, Instructor Rock gathered them in the foyer of the sleeper center and led them outside. In the snowy parks that surrounded the white building, other awakened were leading their own batches of sleepers to the same destination. It was the Academy's medical center. The center looked more like a shrine than a hospital. Its interior contained both highly advanced technology as well as some of the best healers among the awakened. For the duration of their first journey into the dream realm, the bodies of sleepers would be kept safe in specially designed pods and sustained by the magical powers of those healers if anything unfortunate were to happen on the other side of the spell. Of course, whether or not they would wake up in the end wholly depended on the sleepers themselves. To Sunny's surprise, after entering the medical center, Instructor Rock did not take them directly to the wing containing sleeper pods. Instead, he led them to a comparatively deserted floor, and then opened the doors to a spacious gallery that was brightly illuminated by the beautiful crimson rays of the setting sun. There they saw rows and rows of wheelchairs. In each wheelchair, there was a person with a blank, strangely peaceful expression on their face. All these people were completely silent, motionless, and still. They did not show any reaction to the appearance of guests. They all seemed to be empty. In the eerie silence, Sunny felt his hair standing up and a creeping terror sipping deep into his heart. Instructor Rock looked at the empty people with solemn eyes. "There is a reason I brought you all here. Look well and remember. Some of you may know who these people are. For those of you who don't, they are called Hollow." He gritted his teeth. Each one of them was once either a sleeper or an awakened. Some of them were weak, some of them were strong, some were even incredibly powerful. All of them have perished in the dream realm. Their souls are gone, Sunny realized, horrified. If you're lucky, once your spirit is destroyed, your body dies with it. But if not, you will become just like them. Hollow. Instructor Rock glanced in the direction where Castor and Naphis stood, and then added, "So don't die out there." Half an hour later, sleepers had been led to their personal rooms and were preparing to enter the pods. In one of the rooms, the blind girl, Cassia, was helplessly trying to orient herself in the unfamiliar space, touching the wall and strange pieces of machinery with her hands. Tears were streaming down her beautiful, doll-like face. In the other room, proud legacy Castor was staring listlessly at the floor. His lips were moving, repeating one strange phrase over and over again. He was trembling. Somewhere else, changing star Naphis, the last daughter of the immortal Flame clan, was looking down at her hands. Underneath her skin, soft white radiance was slowly growing brighter and brighter. Her face was contorted in a grimace of harrowing agony. And finally, there was a room where Sunless, lost from light, turned away from the sleeping pod and glanced down at his shadow. "Well, are you ready?" The shadow shrugged and didn't answer. Sunny sighed. "Yeah, me too." With that, he stepped forward and climbed into the pod. In the vast echoing darkness, he heard, "Welcome to the dream realm, Sunless." Sunny was expecting to first look at the place where his arrival to the dream realm was going to take place from above, just like it had happened at the beginning of the first nightmare. Back then, time had magically moved in reverse, giving him an opportunity to see hints of what he was going to face. Instead, immediately after hearing the greetings of the spell, Sunny found himself blind and drowning. As he instinctively tried to open his mouth to scream, salty water rushed inside, making him choke and twitch. More than that, he couldn't see anything. No, it's not that he couldn't see, it's just there was no source of light around. Usually, darkness wasn't a problem for Sunny, but for some reason, his sight wasn't working anymore. Maybe the seawater he was submerged in was blocking it. If it wasn't for the special space perception that the affinity to shadows gave him, he would have been completely disoriented. With its help, though, he barely managed to understand which side was down and which side was up. Luckily, teacher Julius' lessons had included swimming. Swearing to thank both the old man and Master Jet once he came back, Sunny forced himself to stay calm and began to swim upward. In a few long and tense seconds, his head broke through the surface of the water. Sunny was finally able to draw in a deep, hoarse breath. "Breathe, breathe, you're still alive." After sucking in enough air to soothe his burning lungs and compose himself to a certain degree, Sunny carefully spun in the water, trying to take in his surroundings. What met him was an endless, jet-black expanse of undulating waves. Above them was an empty black sky. There was no moon, no stars, just a dark vastness of repressive nothingness. Sunny blinked a few times, cold dread taking hold of his heart. This is a sea, an ocean. Was I dropped in the middle of an ocean? No, it couldn't be. There had to be solid ground somewhere nearby. As he was gripped by a momentary panic, a remote sound suddenly drew his attention. Sunny turned around and saw a triangular dorsal fin moving in his direction. Luckily, it was still hundreds and hundreds of meters away. Wait, if it's so far away, then how come I can see it so clearly? Despite being submerged in water, Sunny still felt like there was suddenly cold sweat all over his body. By his estimation, that dorsal fin was at least 5 meters tall. It was rapidly approaching, growing visibly larger with each second. "Damn you, spell." With eyes full of horror, Sunny spun again, desperately trying to find something, anything, to save him. And there, a short distance away, he finally noticed a black mass protruding slightly above the water. Not wasting even a second on thinking, he started to swing his arms and legs, swimming in the direction of the black mass with a considerable speed. However, no matter how fast he swam, the giant shadow of the unknown creature was closing the distance between them much faster. A small part of Sunny's mind managed to preserve its rationality, even when faced with this boundless, primal fear. Not allowing himself to slip entirely into panic, Sunny tried to think, and then silently commanded his own shadow to wrap itself around his body. Instantly, his speed increased twofold. Just seconds before the unknown colossus got to him, Sunny reached the black mass, stretched out his hands, and pulled himself out of the water. He rolled away from the edge, scratching his skin on the uneven rocks, and jumped in fright when the whole surface underneath him shuddered, as though something massive had collided with it. As Sunny backed out, terrifying jaws appeared from the water, with rows and rows of giant teeth, each one as long as he was tall. He opened his eyes wide, understanding that the rock he had climbed on was not tall enough to save him from the monster. Why is it even trying to eat me? I'm too small to be considered a filling snack for something this enormous. However, before the monster had a chance to attack, a colossal tentacle suddenly broke through the water and rose into the air like some strange, black tower. Before too long, it fell down, entangling the owner of the giant maw and pulling it back under the water. Sunny lost the feeling in his legs and plopped on the ground, his mouth opened. His whole body was shaking. A few seconds later, the dark sea was calm again, as though nothing has happened. The indifferent waves continued to move silently under the lightless sky. So, it wasn't trying to eat me, he realized, frozen. It was trying to run away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. A few minutes later, Sunny was pretty sure that nothing was going to devour him. At least not immediately. With that certainty, he was finally in a state of mind to stop trembling and explore his surroundings a little. The black mass he climbed onto turned out to be a single stone platform of around 12 meters in diameter. Its surface was mostly flat, covered with grooves and somewhat dry. Due to the regular shape of its edges, it seemed more like something man-made than a natural formation. But then again, here in the dream realm, it was hard to be sure that something man-made was actually made by humans, as opposed to, better not to think about it. The platform wasn't connected to anything, existing as a tiny island in the sea of darkness. There wasn't anything else above the water for as far as Sunny was able to see. After discovering that fact, he also realized something else. It was that he was wet, cold, and completely naked. In his defense, the clothing situation was the last thing one would think about when trying to save themselves from abyssal monsters. Also, it's not like someone was here to witness his stark paleness and private bits. Still, it was sort of cold. Sunny summoned the puppeteer's shroud and watched as dark gray garments covered his body. It even came with a pair of high, soft-soled leather boots. Clad in gray fabric and lusterless leather, he suddenly felt much safer. Not to mention, warm. After that, Sunny sat down in the middle of the platform, as far away from water as he could, and tried to remember the unique characteristic of every explored region of the dream realm he could think of. Unfortunately, none of them matched this starless, dark void. Of course not, he thought with a bit of resentment. Even if some unlucky humans had ever come here, I doubt that they were able to return to the real world alive. Not with those things hiding underwater. Not yet desperate enough to leave the platform and try to swim away in search of land. Sunny decided to wait and see. Maybe something was going to change as time went by. With a soft sigh, he habitually looked for his shadow. However, due to the total darkness that surrounded him, it couldn't really be seen. He just barely felt its presence. This must be a paradise for you, right? All this gloom and not a star in sight. The shadow, of course, did not answer. Anyway, good job earlier. With a nod, Sunny lay down, using his hands as a pillow. Not thinking about much, he stared into the black sky and waited. The sound of the undulating waves was, actually, quite relaxing. After a while, he closed his eyes and listened. Minutes merged together, growing into hours. Suddenly, Sunny caught a slight change in the sound of the sea. It was as though something was shifting. He opened his eyes and noticed that one corner of the sky was slowly turning gray. Soon, a glimpse of a pale sun could be seen rising above the horizon. A new day had come to the starless void, and with it the dark sea suddenly surged. The black, opaque water suddenly surged and seethed, as though a living creature, desperately trying to avoid the pale light of the coming dawn. Sunny slowly rose and, after some thought, carefully approached the edge of the stone platform. Looking down, he blinked, and then kneeled to make sure that what he saw wasn't an illusion. The sea seemed to be receding, slowly at first, and then faster and faster. The water level was dropping. The circular stone formation he had been taking shelter on used to barely protrude out of the waves, but now there were meters and meters of wet rock between him and the restless surface of the sea. As the sun climbed up, the monstrous ebb tide continued. Soon, Sunny found himself standing on the edge of a tall cliff, with 100-meter drop separating him from the churning waters. Beneath him, the rock formation broadened and changed shape. However, from his vantage point, it was hard to determine what that shape was exactly. At that time, the dark surface of the water began to be punctured here and there by sharp crimson blades. As it dropped even further, it was as though a crimson forest was slowly rising from the black depths. The trees were made of something resembling coral, growing chaotically into each other and stretching toward the sky. They were colossal in size, with irregular protrusions entwining and merging together, looking monumental and eerie in the black and red reality of the sunlit void. The labyrinth formed by this strange reef stretched as far as Sunny could see, broken here and there by protruding cliffs, sudden chasms, and distant natural features. Half an hour later, utterly shocked, Sunny stared down and realized that the sea was completely gone. If not for the black seaweed left hanging on wet rocks and scarlet pillars of coral, he would even doubt if it was ever there. His small circular island had turned into the peak of a strange, towering, irregularly shaped cliff. Looking down, he felt his head spinning. By then, the night had already fully retreated, letting morning finally take its place. "I'm not seeing things, am I?" Sunny thought, pinching himself. What the spell was that? Despite the sudden disappearance of the dark sea and its hidden monsters, Sunny was in no rush to climb down from his circular stone platform. Firstly, he felt that if the sea was able to disappear, it was surely able to come back, perhaps at any moment. Secondly, he did not know what dangers the coral labyrinth was hiding. Perhaps there was something even scarier than the owner of the giant tentacle down there. But that did not mean that he wasn't going to explore. Coming back to his spot in the middle of the platform, Sunny sat down and commanded his shadow to separate itself from his body. Then, taking control of it, he approached the edge of the platform and nimbly slid down. Habitually moving from one shadow to another, he began the descent. At this moment, Sunny was glad that shadows had no weight and were not affected by gravity. While the shadow was busy climbing down, Sunny yawned. "Say, don't you think that you need a name?" Although his shadow was already too far away to hear him, they still could communicate through their shared connection. Of course, the fact that it could did not mean that it would. The shadow was sort of taciturn, mostly because it didn't have vocal cords and was unable to speak. Plus, its temper wasn't that great. How about shameless? No. What about shady? Also no. What about something simpler like? What? Well, do you have suggestions then? All right. We will shelve this conversation for later. By the time he was done with this short monologue, the shadow had already reached the bottom of the cliff. The range of shadow control was not limitless, but it was just barely enough to explore their nearest surroundings. Entering the labyrinth, Sunny found it to be extremely disorienting and convoluted. The paths between coral pillars were sometimes broad, sometimes narrow. They twisted and turned without any logic, often leading to dead ends or even back to where he started. More than that, some paths entered inside the coral mounds, turning into dark tunnels. The labyrinth was vast and multi-layered, making Sunny's head hurt after multiple fruitless attempts to memorize the layout of the nearest pathways. In the end, he sent the shadow up, forcing it to climb on top of the crimson forest and start jumping from one sharp coral blade to another, knowing full well that he himself would not be able to do the same. Soon, he circled the strange cliff and froze, scared by the sight of what was happening in its shadow. There, the corpse of the giant shark-like creature that had briefly pursued him the previous night was laying on the ground, the pillars of coral around it shattered and broken. More precisely, half of it was there, with grotesque innards spilling out of the terrible wound and stretching far away into the distance. The other half was gone, as though it had never existed. Around the corpse, hundreds of smaller monsters were scurrying, tearing away and devouring its flesh bit by bit. Each of them was about 2.5 meters tall, looking like a weird mix of a demonic crab, a centaur, and a nightmare. They had 4 pairs of long, segmented legs that ended in scythe-like protrusions. At the front, a human-like torso was protruding from the carapace, also clad in thick chitinous armor. The head, if it was even the appropriate word, was situated directly on top of the torso, with no neck in between. It had two narrow eye slits and a viscous-looking mouth with several slimy mandibles. Instead of hands, the monsters had two enormous pincers. Currently, they were all using those pincers to tear off chunks of meat off the desiccated corpse and stuff them into their mouths. From time to time, a fight for an especially juicy piece of meat would break out, ending up in a few monsters being torn apart and quickly devoured by the victors. Sunny swallowed, both because the sight of heavily armored, powerful monsters made him nervous, and because looking at them feasting, he suddenly felt very hungry. Each of them seems like trouble, and there are hundreds of them. His luck, like always, was awful. At least I don't have to wonder why the labyrinth feels so empty. All the inhabitants are having a party. Feeling a little bit comprehensive about turning his shadows back to the monsters, Sunny commanded it to look back and study the cliff he was taking shelter atop of. Something about it was making him feel uneasy. The shadow turned around and looked up, taking in the sight of the strangely shaped cliff. It took Sunny a few minutes to shift his perspective and recognize it for what it was. That's a finger. That's a hand. That is a sword. He blinked. It's a statue. Indeed, the cliff was man-made. It was an ancient, colossal statue, at least 200 meters tall. The scale of it was so massive that it boggled the mind. From what Sunny could see, it depicted a knight clad in an elaborate plate armor, with 7 shining stars carved into his breastplate. In his hands, he was holding a gargantuan sword, pointing it to the ground. However, the most striking thing about it was that the giant stone knight was missing his head. In fact, the roughly circular platform Sunny was standing on turned out to be the top of his neck. And by the looks of it, the head wasn't missing by design. It was as though something, or someone, had violently tore it off at some point in the distant past. Sunny walked around the platform, looking down from all sides, but didn't notice the head lying anywhere near. What on earth is this place? Without any hints to find the answer, he led his shadow back to the giant's neck and settled at the western edge of it, studying the feasting monsters. He didn't move until the sun was about to set. Just as Sunny expected, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, a deafening rumble could be heard coming from somewhere below. The monsters instantly stopped their feast and scurried away, some hiding inside the coral pillars, some simply burying themselves in the soft soil. A few minutes later, the first streams of black water appeared in the labyrinth. Their volume quickly grew, and soon an apocalyptic flood devoured everything around. The sea was returning with the approach of the night. Sunny stared at this unimaginable process, thoughts churning in his head. In an hour, the circular platform was the only thing above the dark waters once again. With an empty stomach and a head full of thoughts, Sunny returned to the center of the platform and sat down. After a while, he beckoned to his shadow and said, "Wake me up if anything happens." Then, he closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. His consciousness quickly slid into the sweet embrace of darkness, giving Sunny some well-needed rest. In the middle of the night, however, a sudden impulse stirred him awake. Sunny jumped to his feet, his groggy mind full of tense apprehension. He was afraid that the owner of the giant tentacle had come back to finish the job, or maybe some other horror from the depths had sensed him and decided to snack on human meat. However, the sea was quiet and calm. He didn't hear any abnormalities around the knight's statue. "What is it?" Sunny whispered, addressing the shadow. The shadow silently pointed him in a particular direction. Turning his head, Sunny squinted. He quickly understood why it was a good idea to wake up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to see. Out there in the distance, a few kilometers away, a small orange light was shimmering in the darkness. Its reflections were rising and falling with the movement of waves. It was too far away to make out any details, so Sunny just stared at it for a while. Pretty soon the light disappeared. Other sleepers, natural phenomenon, or some monster laying a trap. Memories of nightmarish deepwater creatures immediately came to his mind. Shaking his head, Sunny lay back down and attempted to return to his slumber. However, This time sleep was escaping him. Pangs of hunger were still not unbearable, but slowly becoming more and more intense. The thirst, however, was worse. In the end, he remained awake up until the sun rose again, sending the dark sea in retreat. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. As soon as the morning came, the pincer monsters crawled back from their hiding spots and rushed to the giant carcass to continue their feast. Sunny watched them for some time and then walked to the opposite side of the platform to take a look in the direction where he had seen the mysterious light the previous night. At a considerable distance from the headless statue, 5 or 6 kilometers away, the ground rose naturally and formed something akin to a hill. On top of that hill, an especially massive coral pillar rose to the sky. From the looks of it, its upper branches were just high enough to stay above water in the night. Various ideas stormed into Sunny's head, but at the end of it, only 2 questions were really important. First of all, would he be able to find the way through the labyrinth and cover that distance during the day? And more importantly, should he even attempt to do it? After all, there was no indication that the source of the mysterious light was something beneficial, as opposed to dreadful and deadly. Not having enough information to make a choice, Sunny settled back to study the monsters. He did, however, send the shadow to investigate as far into the labyrinth as the range of shadow control allowed, hoping to chart at least the beginning of the path that could potentially lead him to that hill. Logically speaking, he was as safe atop the headless statue as he probably could be in this strange place. The only problem was, he was going to die soon because of thirst or hunger. Both problems were solvable if he were to venture down. He could desalinate the seawater in a number of ways taught to him by teacher Julius, with materials that were present pretty much everywhere in the dream realm. He could also prepare traps and hunt a pincer monster to eat. With their massive size, just one of them would be enough to feed him for weeks. He could easily see such a routine, hunting by day, returning to the statue at the approach of the night. It was probably his safest choice. However, this way of doing things lacked one vital element: the potential for improvement. It was well suited for keeping Sunny alive, but had no way of giving him hope. If he was destined to spend the rest of his life in the small area surrounding the headless statue, devouring monsters and trembling at night, in fear of being devoured by something bigger in turn, well, he would rather just jump down and end it right now. That pretty much meant that the only choice left for him was to try and reach the source of the orange light. And if Sunny was really trying to attempt it, he had to do it before the pincer monsters were done consuming the giant carcass. That way, at least, the surrounding segment of the labyrinth was going to be free of them. Firm in his choice, Sunny decided to leave the headless statue the next morning. He would spend the rest of today exploring paths through the labyrinth and preparing himself mentally. With that, he closed his eyes and concentrated his perception on the moving shadow. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the night, a sudden storm descended upon the dark sea. Sunny was stirred awake by the shadow, in time to prepare himself for the crushing winds and the pelting rain. Usually, rain always put him in a bad mood, but this time he was too thirsty to think about anything except for fresh water. Staying low so as to not be blown over the edge of the platform, Sunny cupped his hands and waited until they became filled with rainwater. Then he raised them to his mouth and greedily drank. Strikes of lightning illuminated everything above the churning sea. If anyone were to see Sunny now, they would have noticed a wide grin on his face. The storm continued to rampage for several hours. Sunny crouched in the middle of the platform, enduring its rage. More than once, a tall wave would crash into the headless knight's neck, threatening to wash him away. But Sunny held tight to the deep grooves in the stone surface of the platform, sticking to it like glue. By morning, when the storm finally dissipated, all of his muscles were sore. But there was no time to waste. As soon as the monsters came back to the carcass, with a few stragglers quickly following behind, he slid over the edge of the platform and began to nimbly climb down. Sunny had to thank wilderness survival classes once again, since he had been taught the basics of rock climbing as well. Teacher Julius was adamant about giving his student a crash course in all possible forms of traversal. Additionally, Sunny had already scouted the optimal way down and memorized the best holds and indentions to grab onto with the help of his shadow. Soon his feet finally touched the ground, despite the fact that leaving the safety of the headless statue was going to put him in considerable danger. Sunny instantly felt his mood improving. Remaining passive for the last couple of days did not suit his character well. Now, even if his plan were to end in failure, at least he was going to go down doing something that he had decided to do. Trying and failing was better than not trying at all. The black mud was deep enough to slow him down, but not to the extent he had been afraid of. With some practice, Sunny was soon able to walk at an acceptable speed. What's more, as long as he stuck to the shadows, his steps were light and silent, producing no squelching noises from the mud. He headed for one of the paths that were supposed to lead him to the distant hill, and entered the cool shade of the crimson labyrinth. Immediately, a strange feeling enveloped his mind. It was as though the world beyond the labyrinth did not exist anymore, and all that was left were its twisting, dark paths. This thing almost seems endless. Shaking his head, Sunny sent the shadow to scout ahead, hoping to be notified of any latent danger in advance, and began to move forward. His life now depended on whether or not he would reach the distant hill before the sun began to set. He didn't even want to think about what would happen if he were still inside the labyrinth. Once the dark sea came back in an unstoppable flood, the shadow moved ahead of him, not meeting any hurdles. Sometimes it would climb high to scout the direction of different paths, allowing Sunny to choose the optimal route most of the time. However, he still had to backtrack a considerable distance once or twice, ending up either in a dead end or on a path leading in the wrong direction. Despite that, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Sunny even had time to carefully study the interior of the labyrinth, noticing more details of its composition, as well as a frightening amount of unrecognizable bones hiding in the mud beneath his feet. Because of how well things were going, he lowered his guard a little. His arrogance was also to blame with his extensive preparations and skillful control of the Shadow Scout. Sunny subconsciously patted himself on the shoulder and assumed that everything was going to be fine. That's why, when the mud directly in front of him started to move, he was a fraction of a second late to react. In the next moment, a massive pincer shot out of the ground and tore through the air, threatening to cut his body in half with one crushing strike. Crap, this was the only thought in Sunny's head as he awkwardly fell backward, allowing the pincer to close right in front of his face with a loud clack. The jagged, chitinous blades were so close that he could clearly see bits of mud sticking to their surface. Sunny landed on his back, narrowly avoiding the unexpected strike. The good thing was that he managed to avoid being injured or even killed. The bad thing was that he was sprawled on the ground, unable to quickly create distance between him and the attacker. The massive pincer was still hovering above. Just as this realization dawned on Sunny, he desperately rolled to the side. In the next moment, the pincer lunged down, sending small tremors through the mud. If not for his quick reaction, Sunny's chest would have been caved in by that blow. He was just beginning to stand up when the pincer swiped sideways. Luckily, Sunny was ready. Instead of trying to dodge or block the attack, he went with it, letting the pincer collide with his outstretched hands and cushioning the blow. As his arms screamed in pain, Sunny used the force of the blow and allowed his body to be sent flying through the air. This way, at least, he would get out of the pincer's range. He might not have been taught how to fight, but one thing he knew very well was how to fall. Instead of breaking his neck or having the breath beaten out of him by the landing, he braced his body and nimbly rolled before stopping some distance away from the ambushing monster. I take it back. Sunny, though, remembering his sarcastic critique of heroes' battle rolls. Rolling is an integral part of any respectable monster fighting technique. Then he looked up, trying to ascertain the situation. In front of him, the attacker had finally shown itself. It burrowed from under the mud, casting a vast shadow over kneeling Sunny. Its tiny eyes were full of rage, hunger, and malice. It was one of the pincer monsters he had spent so much time observing. Towering over him at almost 3 meters in height, the bulky creature moved its mandibles and produced a jarring, piercing screech. "Why aren't you devouring the giant carcass with the rest of your buddies, you crab bastard?" However, The answer to Sunny's indignant plea was rather obvious. The monster seemed to be in a rather bad shape. Half of its 8 scythe-like legs were broken, and there were cracks in its thick carapace, each oozing with viscous azure blood. Additionally, he was missing one of its 2 pincer arms, which seemed to have been torn off entirely at the shoulder. If not for this pathetic state, the creature would have had no need to hide in the mud, hoping to catch easy prey. It could have just followed the other monsters and joined on the feast. Sunny was just unlucky to stumble directly upon its ambush. He had relied too much on the scouting abilities of his shadow, forgetting that it wasn't much more observant than an awakened human. It was also weightless and inaudible. That's why the monster did not react when the shadow had passed over its trap a minute earlier. On the other hand, Sunny could also consider himself lucky by the same logic. He would not have been able to dodge the creature's sudden attack if not for its crippled, slowed state. But pondering on his luck could wait for later. Right now, Sunny had a far more pressing thing to do, namely try to survive. "Get back here," he ordered the shadow and jumped to the side. In the next second, the space he occupied a moment before was torn apart by the attacking monster. Its heavy pincer crashed into the side of a coral pillar, sending crimson shards flying in every direction. Sunny caught his balance and continued moving. He was hoping that the bulky, heavily armored, wounded creature would not be able to match his speed, but unfortunately, it turned out to be surprisingly agile. Its scythe-like legs pierced the mud behind him, and the pincer was already flying through the air again, threatening to decapitate the young man at any second. Sunny ducked, dodging the pincer, and finally caught a second of reprieve. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for something to use as a weapon. Almost instantly, he noticed a long, smooth, sharp bone left behind by some unknown creature sticking from the mud. Without slowing down, he bent down and grabbed the bone, pulling it out with one forceful tug. The bone was almost 1.5 meters long, ending in a narrow, sharp tip. It was almost like a spear. The problem was, even with the added length of this makeshift spear, Sunny's range of attack was still shorter than the monster's. He also doubted that it was capable of piercing the hard carapace. In short, he had to get close and aim for one of the cracks in the creature's armor. However, he didn't dare to. At that short of a distance, the monster could easily crush him into a paste by using just its weight and hulking frame. A crazy idea entered Sunny's mind. A bit shocked, he momentarily couldn't decide whether it was the product of audacity or foolishness. Either way, he wasn't insane enough to actually consider it. At that moment, the pincer lashed out again. This time, Sunny was a little late to evade, and as a result, a sharp pain pierced his left leg. It was grazed by the edge of the pincer. The puppeteer's shroud held, not allowing the monster to draw blood, but the force of the impact was enough to throw Sunny tumbling to the ground. There was no time to recover. As his eyes opened wide, Sunny understood that it was time to act crazy. So instead of trying to dodge, he stopped moving and allowed the monster to grab him across his torso with the pincer. Immediately, a terrible pressure descended on his ribs. Sunny felt as though he was going to be split apart, but his armor, received from defeating an awakened tyrant, resisted the crushing bite of the monster's pincer. Every muscle in his body tensed, delaying the moment when his insides would be turned into mush. In the next second, Sunny's shadow fell from above, wrapping itself around the puppeteer's shroud. With the protective properties of the armor enhanced, he was able to better resist the pincer's pulverizing embrace. Sunny and the monster appeared to be at an impasse. The young man couldn't free himself from the monster's grip, while the monster could not kill the prey by cutting it in halves with its pincer. They stared at each other. Then, an insane fire ignited in the creature's eyes. It clicked its mandibles and raised Sunny in the air, bringing him closer to its mouth, obviously intent on biting his head off. "Why is everyone trying to eat me? Am I that tasty?" Sunny didn't struggle, as the monster brought him close to its mandibles. He knew he only had one chance to live. In the last moment, Sunny allowed the shadow to flow from Puppeteer's shroud onto the sharp bone he was still clenching in his hand. Then he gathered all his strength, leaned forward and thrust the bone forward with as much power as he could. Guided by his hand, The dark bone spear shot forward and pierced through the creature's tiny eye, sinking in deep. The other eye of the monster narrowed. Gritting his teeth from the unbearable pain in his ribs, Sunny twisted the bone, trying to do as much damage to the creature's brain as possible. For a couple of seconds, nothing happened. Then, he felt the pressure on his body diminishing. The pincer opened, letting Sunny fall down. As he hit the mood, the hulking monster crashed to the ground too. The bone spear was still sticking from its head, bathed in the streams of azure liquid. Sunny moaned and drew in a raspy, painful breath. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. You have received a memory, azure blade. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was sprawled in the mud, trying to catch his breath. The subtle voice of the spell echoed in his ears. Your shadow grows stronger. Immediately, he felt a slight change. His body grew a little bit stronger, his vision a little sharper, his skin a little smoother. The change was minimal but apparent. What was that? He had a guess, and it was easy to confirm. Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 14 out of 1,000. Previously, he only had 12 of the mysterious shadow fragments, with no knowledge on how to acquire more. Now it seemed that the process was automatic. He only had to kill an enemy to absorb a part of their shadow and enhance his own core. More than that, the number of fragments he was able to receive wasn't directly correlated to the number of slain enemies. After a bit of thinking, Sunny came to a preliminary conclusion. Dormant soul cores gave him 1 fragment, while awakened ones gave 2. However, only enemies he defeated directly more or less counted. Killing the Mountain King's larva, a dormant beast, had given him 1 shadow fragment. Finishing off the veteran slaver, a dormant human another. Mountain King itself was an awakened tyrant, which meant that it had 5 awakened cores. With each giving Sunny 2 shadow fragments, he ended up with a total of 12. And now, after killing the carapace scavenger, he had 14. Interestingly, he didn't receive any fragments from the deaths of Shifty, Scholar, and Hero, even though they perished as a result of his machinations. It seems he had to finish an enemy off with his own 2 hands, to absorb a part of their shadow. Well, or at least by summoning an ancient dead god. The process was quite similar to how normal awakened increased their power, with the only difference being that the steps of extracting and consuming the corresponding material, soul shards, were skipped in favor of instant absorption. That meant that shadow fragments could not be stored, and subsequently could not be bought or traded. He won't have an opportunity to receive them as a reward for completing missions, providing services, or selling various spoils. If Sunny wanted to grow stronger, his only option was to fight and kill. No peaceful life for me, I guess. Previously, Sunny thought that he at least had the choice to choose a relatively safe path. Many awakened never left the confines of human citadels, and never faced nightmare creatures, choosing instead to perform various jobs in the dream realm, just as they would in the real world. They received payments in the form of soul shards, which were simultaneously the fuel of one's progression and the universal currency inside the citadels. Sunny was never set on pursuing such a life, but not even having a choice was sort of irritating. Luckily, there was a bright side too. Without the need to use soul shards to strengthen his core, he would be able to spend everything he earns freely and without concern. After all, after he kills an enemy and absorbs the shadow fragments, the soul shard would still be there, ready to be collected and exchanged for something Sunny might need in the future. That would effectively make him twice as efficient in terms of earning and spending, which was not a small advantage. Additionally, there was the matter of the shadow core. Since both Sunny and his shadow were tied to it, strengthening the core would not only increase Sunny's power, but also enhance the shadow. So, if he were to use it to further empower himself, the actual effect would be stacked, producing a 2-fold enhancement. So, for each shadow fragment he collected, Sunny would actually be able to rip twice as much benefit as an awakened would from a soul shard. Not bad at all. The future was bright, provided he survived and gets the opportunity to even have a future, of course. Sitting up, Sunny moved his eyes and found the cluster of runes describing his memories. Azure Blade. Had he finally gotten a weapon? Memory, Azure Blade. Memory rank awakened. Memory type, weapon. Memory description. On this forgotten shore only steel remembers. Huh, interesting. Not very informative, but interesting. Sunny summoned his new weapon, and a sharp, light sword immediately appeared in his hand. It was about a meter long, including the handle. The blade was straight and single-edged, ending in an angular tip. It was forged out of azure steel, with a beautiful layered pattern. Deep inside the steel, white sparks could be seen. The crossguard was minimalistic and simple, offering almost no protection to the wielder's hands. If Sunny knew his way around cold weapons, he would have called it a tang dao. However, he had no idea about such things. All he could gather was that the blade was single-edged, which meant that it was probably meant for slashing and cutting as opposed to piercing, and that the handle was long enough to accommodate two hands. Also, the sword was pretty. He summoned the shadow and made it wrap itself around the azure blade. Immediately, the steel became bluish-black, with a scattering of white sparks. It looked like a starlit night sky. Sunny stood up and waved the sword a couple of times, getting accustomed to its weight. The sharp edge whistled as it cut the air. Well, now I finally look like a real awakened. After that, he cast a gaze at the corpse of the carapace scavenger and grimaced. This part was not going to be pleasant. After some time, he managed to break open the cracked carapace and cut away a few strips of tender, pink meat. He also did not forget to extract the radiant crystal from the beast's chest, the soul shard. Without much hope, he tried to absorb the shard, remembering how it was supposed to be done just as he expected. Nothing happened. They are really of no direct use to me. With a shrug, Sunny places the shard and the meat in a makeshift rucksack. He weaved from black seaweed and looked at the sun. The day was still young. He still had a good chance of making it to the distant hill before the sea came back. However, his left leg was banged up in the fight with the scavenger beast, so walking wasn't as easy as it was before. He gritted his teeth and began limping. Hours passed. Due to his bruises and increased vigilance, Sunny's progress slowed down considerably. He was sweating and grinding his teeth, feeling pain with each step. What's worse, the further he reached into the labyrinth, the more confusing and entangled the paths became. Even with the shadow's help, he constantly had to backtrack and struggled to move in the right direction. Crap, crap, crap. If nothing changed, Sunny would not reach his goal, which meant that he will be crushed to death by the returning sea. Not allowing himself to think about dying, Sunny tried to walk faster. However, he couldn't be too hasty. Making a wrong turn would have taken precious minutes away from him, so he had to choose the way carefully. Additionally, missing to notice another ambush could end his life directly. Curses. Just when he was beginning to feel desperate, his shadow suddenly saw something that momentarily sent Sunny into a stupor. Some distance further down the path, beyond a few turns, the corals widened, creating a small clearing, and in the middle of that clearing, someone was walking across the mud. The first thing Sunny saw was fair skin, a lot of skin. The tall, lithe girl was only dressed in a makeshift skirt and a crude brassiere, both made out of seaweed. However, it didn't seem to bother her. With a calm expression, she stopped and looked back. The wind was playing with her short silver hair. It was Nephis, the changing star. In one hand, she was holding the end of a strange golden rope, and on the other end of the rope, Cassia, the blind girl, was carefully following behind. Gray sky above, black mud below, an endless sea of crimson in between. On this dreamlike backdrop, two beautiful girls were walking across the labyrinth. One was delicate and fragile, with blonde hair and cerulean, aimless eyes. She was dressed in a simple tunic, with leather sandals on her feet, and a cloak the color of sea waves draped around her shoulders. The other was tall and lithe. She had silky silver hair and clear gray eyes. Her revealing clothes were crudely made out of black seaweed, leaving her fair skin and athletic build exposed. She was poised, alert, and barefoot. A golden rope connected two girls together. Wow, what a sight, Sunny thought. He suddenly regretted that he was not an artist. The picture just begged to be made into a painting. Wait, why am I thinking about that? People, I found people. His heart skipped a bit. If Nephis and Cassia were here, then the orange light from before, most likely, had something to do with them, which meant that they knew how to get to the tall hill. which meant that Sunny didn't have to be crushed to death by the high tide. So what do I do now? He wasn't the best at ingratiating himself to other people. In fact, he was the polar opposite. People usually instinctively avoided him. And that was in normal circumstances. This time, however, he had spent a whole of 4 weeks making sure that everyone in the academy hated his guts. Good job, Sunny. Still, he was at least useful. In this situation, an additional body was already a great boon when facing hungry monsters. And he wasn't just anyone. His ability to scout ahead alone was worth a lot. Surely they will understand that. Right. With a heavy sigh, Sunny stepped into shadows and hurried to the clearing. He reached it in a minute or so, hiding and observing the 2 girls before making a final decision. Helping herself with the wooden staff, blind Cassia slowly approached the middle of the clearing and extended her hand, finding Nephis and touching her on the shoulder. Why did you stop? Nephis supported the blind girl and glanced at the sky. It's getting late. An awkward pause hung between 2 girls. After some time, Cassia asked, so you think we should turn back? Nephis blinked and cleared her throat. Yes. Sunny was a bit amused by their exchange. What is she? A strong, silent type. Then he returned to his dilemma and grimaced. How do I approach them? Damn, why is this so hard? It's not like I'm trying to ask them out on a date. I mean one of them, both of them. What am I thinking about? Just go and say hi, but then, if he suddenly appeared out of the shadows, not at all like a creep, how high was the probability of them getting spooked and attacking him before noticing that he was not a monster? Wait, why would they? Arg, to hell with this. Deciding on the safest approach, Sunny commanded his shadow to abandon its hiding place and move to a spot where Nephis could clearly see it. He could clearly sense the shadow rolling its eyes as it obeyed the order. As soon as the shadow started to move, Nephis suddenly snapped her hand sideways. Immediately, a long sword appeared in it, cutting the air as it assumed a defensive position. Before the shadow could even take 2 steps out of its hiding spot, it was already pierced by Changing Star's gray eyes. The shadow froze. It seemed a bit startled. Cassia took a step back. Neph, what is it? Nephis didn't answer immediately, carefully observing the shadow. Then she simply said, there's a shadow. Cassia's doll-like face paled. A shadow? Scavengers. The tall girl tilted her head a little. No, it's a human shadow. This was clearly not what Cassia expected to hear. With an expression of surprise, she asked, a human shadow? What is it doing? Nephis hesitated. After a while, she answered in a flat tone, it's waving at us. Asterisk. After a whole minute of silence, Cassia finally found the words to react. What? I said it's waving. Yes, I know, I mean, why is it doing that? Nephis opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't know. Maybe it's a distraction to lure us into a trap. At this point, Sunny decided that it was time to talk. He inhaled deeply, then said in a friendly tone, actually, I just sent it ahead to make sure that you don't stab me with that sword before realizing that I'm human. Immediately, Nephis turned her head, pinpointing the exact location where Sunny was hiding in a blotch of shadows. Her sword slightly shifted, aiming at the new threat. If you're human, why are hiding in the shadows like a creep? God admit, I'm not a creep. Sunny shoked. But his flaw was merciless. He had to provide an answer, and a truthful one at that. I mean, you're Changing Star Nephis. To be honest, I'm a little afraid. Nephis did not answer. Because of her hard-to-read face, it was almost impossible to determine whether she believed him or not. However, he included her true name in his answer for a reason. If he was some monster pretending to be human, he wouldn't have known it. Luckily, Cassia was more expressive. Are you the boy who sat with me in the cafeteria? Sunny smiled. Meanwhile, Nephis glanced at the blind girl. Do you know him? Cassia nodded. I recognize his voice. His name is Sunless. He was in second to last place in the rankings, right above me. The tall girl frowned, as if trying to remember. Then she asked, the pervert. The smile disappeared from Sunny's face, replaced by exasperation. Oh, come on. Cassia hesitated and didn't answer. Hey, I'm not really a pervert, you know. I just, said a few things to a few girls. It was all a misunderstanding. Nephis was silent for a few seconds, and then, finally, dismissed her sword. Okay, you can come out. Sunny limped out of the shadows, summoning his own back. It flowed to his feet and reattached itself, visibly shaking. The bastard was laughing at him, stopping a few meters away from Nephis. He raised his hands, showing that he didn't mean the girls any harm. Changing Star gave him an inquisitive look. What happened to you? She was referring to his limp, bruises, and overall banged-up look. Sunny sighed. Carapace scavenger. Nephis raised an eyebrow. You managed to get away alive. You bet I did. Sunny subconsciously straightened his back. I didn't get away, I killed it. To prove his point, he gestured at his rucksack, full of delicious monster meat. Nephis looked him over again, reevaluating her opinion of him. Now, there were hints of approval in her eyes. Carapace scavengers were only beasts, but they were still awakened. With the addition of their mighty physique and natural armor, defeating one was not an easy feat for any sleeper, who all had a dormant core, let alone someone from the very bottom of the ranking list. Come to think of it, it was even a bit too outstanding. Sunny lowered his eyes. It was already wounded. Nephis shrugged. A kill is a kill, you did well. After that, she fell silent, as though not planning to say anything else. Sunny also wasn't sure what to say. Luckily, Cassia came to the rescue. Are you seriously injured? He shook his head. No, it's just that my ribs and leg are bruised. I will be fine in a day or two. My armor is pretty resilient. He wasn't worried that they might be tempted to kill him, to get the puppeteer's shroud. That was because memories were destroyed at the moment of their owner's death, so they only could be transferred voluntarily by a living person. Well, there was always torture and blackmail, but he doubted that any one of the two beautiful girls would stoop to that. Sunny cleared his throat before stumbling on the scavenger. I was heading for the tall hill with the massive coral pillar on top, but after the fight, my speed decreased. Now I'm worried about not making it in time. Do you perhaps know the way? Cassia smiled. Actually, we spent the last days on that hill. We were just about to go back. Nephis didn't say anything, looking at the sky. Sunny licked his lips. Well, can I come with you? They're not going to say no, right? The blind girl turned her head to her companion, a clear question written on her face. Nephis lowered her eyes, staring at Sunny. After a while, she said, no. What? Problem, no problem. What's wrong with you, princess? Can't you speak faster? Feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest, Sunny smiled. Well, all right. The rest of the way to the tall hill did not take a lot of time, with Nephis leading the way, taking all the right turns at all the right places. There was no need to explore the labyrinth and backtrack after encountering a dead end. Additionally, there were no scavengers around. In fact, they could have moved ever quicker if not for Cassia, who walked slowly even with the help of her staff. Guided by the golden rope, she carefully explored the ground ahead before taking each step. The uneven paths of the Crimson Forest were not an ideal surface for a blind person to walk on. Sunny didn't say much, periodically casting an incredulous glance at the strange pair. No matter how he looked at it, Cassia seemed to be dead weight. Perhaps it was cruel to say, but in the merciless reality of the dream realm, misguided kindness was a sure way to end up dead. Before meeting and observing the girls, he still had hoped that Cassia's terrible flaw hid an unexpected and powerful aspect. But from what he saw, it wasn't the case. If she couldn't even walk properly, what kind of power was there to hide? Nothing could outweigh the ruthless fact that the blind girl couldn't protect herself, and thus would only drag her companions down. One had to be a fool or not fond of living to allow that to happen. So, which one of these descriptions suited Nephis? Somehow, he felt that neither did. The sunset was not far off when they reached the hill. After climbing it and approaching the massive growth of coral, Nephis dismissed the golden rope and immediately summoned it again. This way it was untied and appeared in her hands in a neat bundle. Ah, so it's a memory. Sunny wondered what qualities the magical rope had. Soon his curiosity was satisfied. Right in front of his surprised eyes, the length of the rope suddenly began to increase. Soon it was thrice as long as it was before. Nephis calmly tied both ends of the rope into loops and then threw one of them into the air, accurately coiling it around a prominent protrusion near the top of the coral pillar. Then she tested if the rope would hold, swiftly climbed up and waved from above, giving Sunny the signal to follow. After hesitating for a second, Sunny approached the rope and grabbed it. He couldn't help thinking that this would be the perfect opportunity to cut his head off, with him helpless while climbing and Nephis standing on the top of the pillar. Yeah, the vivid picture appeared in his mind. Stop being paranoid, Sunny thought, trying to calm himself down. It's not that he was sure of changing Star's impeccable moral qualities. Instead, he was certain of one thing. If Nephis really wanted to kill him, she wouldn't have needed to wait for an opportunity. She could have just cut him into ribbons whenever. Simultaneously scared and reassured by this, though, Sunny nimbly climbed up and joined Nephis at the top of the coral mound. He then turned around and watched curiously, wondering how Cassia was going to get to them. The blind girl dismissed the wooden staff and approached the rope. Then she caught it in a hand, traced it down to the loop at the end, and placed her foot inside. As soon as she was done, Nephis grabbed the rope and started pulling, lifting Cassia little by little until she had reached the top. She only had to grab Nephis' hand and make a step to join them. Efficient. The coral mound was much larger than the circular stone platform of the giant knight's neck. In fact, it was almost like a small island. At the highest point of the island, hidden behind some coral blades, the girls had made a little camp. There were piles of seaweed to sleep on, strips of scavenger meat drying under the sun, and a fire pit. Sunny pointed to the makeshift fire pit. Was it you 2 nights ago? I've seen an orange light in the distance. Cassia's face darkened. Yes, this was the first time we made a fire, but it turned out to be a really bad mistake. Nephis sighed. Sunny raised an eyebrow, surprised. Why? The blind girl touched her hair and turned her head to Nephis. At night any light will attract monsters. We were attacked by scavengers first, and then, she paled and didn't finish. But she didn't have to. The memory of the colossal tentacle was still fresh in Sunny's mind. It seemed that he was lucky to meet these 2 when he had. If not, he was certainly going to make a fire tonight to roast some scavenger meat. I see. Nephis looked at the sky and cleared her throat. It should be fine now. We still have time before the sun sets. After that, she got busy making the fire. Cassia simply sat on a pile of seaweed and waited. Not knowing what to do, Sunny lowered himself to the ground and let his tired, bruised body rest. After a while, he said, I have fresh meat in my rucksack. Do you have water? Cassia smiled. Yes. After that, she extended an arm to him. A second later, a beautiful bottle made of patterned blue glass appeared in her hand. That's a memory I have. It's always full. Sunny took the glass bottle and looked at it with envy. An endless supply of water, Sure beats my super loud bell. Thank you. He brought the bottle to his lips and greedily drank the cool, delicious water. Indeed, no matter how much he drank, the amount of water inside did not seem to decrease. Is it really endless? Cassia touched her hair again. Not really. If you turn it upside down and let the water flow, it will stop in half an hour or so, but then it will be full again pretty soon. At that time, Nephis was already done making the fire. Without looking up, she took Sunny's rucksack and opened it. Immediately, the soul shard rolled out. The tall girl looked at it, then at Sunny. Then she put the shard back in and pulled out the meat. Sunny became tense, preparing a misleading answer. But Nephis did not ask, so he pretended like nothing had happened and continued his conversation with Cassia. It's still a great memory. Getting drinkable water is not an easy task. Cassia nodded and smiled, pleased by his words. Soon, the rich smell of roasting meat permeated the air. At the same time, the sun was beginning to approach the horizon. A loud rumble came from somewhere beneath, and first traces of the black water began to appear between crimson walls of the labyrinth. Sunny looked east, where the skies were already growing dark. Then he uncomfortably shifted. Do scavengers come all the way up here? Nephis turned the meat and nodded. Yes, but only at night. In the day, most of them seem to disappear. Sunny grinned, having an idea of why there weren't a lot of monsters in the labyrinth in the day. That's because they all gather near the place I had been spending my time recently. You should have seen it, the tall cliff to the west of here. Well, it's actually a statue. Cassia opened her eyes wide. A statue. But for you to survive, it should be. Yes, it's a giant statue of a knight, at least 200 meters tall. He is missing his head, so I hid on top of the neck. Anyway, the day we were sent here, two sea creatures fought each other near that statue. When the water receded, I saw an enormous carcass lying there, with hundreds of scavengers slowly tearing it apart. Nafis nodded. That would explain the lack of nightmare creature in the day. How long? Sunny blinked. How long what? Changing Star stared at him for a few seconds, making everyone feel uncomfortable. How long? Until they are done devouring the carcass. Oh, 1 day more, 2 at most. Nafis turned away, took the meat away from the fire, and then quickly extinguished it. There's definitely something wrong with that girl. The three of them ate in the dimming light of the twilight. The meat was juicy, tender, and indescribably delicious. It was better than anything Sunny had ever tasted, even back in the Academy's cafeteria. Of course, his excruciating hunger played a part in that. From time to time, they would pass the glass bottle to each other. When they were finished with their meal, the dark sea was back, and the night was upon them. Everything was consumed by absolute darkness. Of course, Sunny could easily see both Nafis and Cassia. Under the cover of the night, Changing Star remained pretty much the same. The blind girl, however, allowed her true emotions to show, thinking that no one would see. She seemed much more lost, lonely and frightened than she did in the day. As if trying to resist these feelings, Cassia said in a bright voice, "How about we formally introduce ourselves? I'm Cassie." Nafis glanced in her direction and shrugged. Next it was Sunny's turn. He exhaled, glad that they didn't ask his name directly. Most likely, he would still have been able to provide his human name, however. It also might have depended on the wording of the question. Relieved, he smiled and answered, "I'm Sunless, but you can call me Sunny." Sunny was slowly growing fond of having conversations in the dark. Without the burden of light, people were more relaxed and honest. It reminded him of the frequent blackouts that used to sweep through the city when he was a little kid. His family had no choice but to huddle together and spend a few hours doing nothing but talking to each other. Now, these dark hours had become some of his most precious memories. He was silent for a few moments and then said, "Since we're going to be depending on each other, should we share what abilities and memories we have at our disposal?" This was a logical suggestion. If they were going to fight side by side, knowing each other's strengths was more or less vital. Still, he noticed Nafis glancing in his direction with a guarded look on her face. Luckily, he was obscured by darkness. "I will start," Sunny said, both to show his sincerity and to reveal information about himself in a controlled manner. If he took the initiative to talk, he still had to tell the truth. But how much and to what extent was still for him to decide. If they were to ask and he had to answer, however, things would become unpredictable. "My attributes give me an affinity to shadows. I also have a slight affiliation to divinity. Lastly, I am prone to finding myself in unlikely situations." Cassie listened carefully, and then lowered her head as though embarrassed. He is telling the truth. Not that we doubted your honesty. Why not? I spent so much time earning the reputation of a pathological liar." Sunny cleared his throat and smiled, hiding his nervousness. "Really? That's good to know, but why are you so sure that I am being honest?" The blind girl shifted a little. "Oh, that's my ability. I can see people's attributes. Sometimes I also receive, visions. They can be about the future or the past. I mean, that's what I think. It only happened a couple of times." Sunny swallowed but then relaxed. "So she is an oracle of sorts. Luckily, her insight is limited to attributes. Otherwise, I'd be in real trouble. Still, I will have to be careful around her." He finally realized how the blind girl had known about his birthday. The question was whether she had seen it in a vision of the future or in a vision of the past. If it was the former, was it safe to assume that he would certainly be able to celebrate at least one more birthday? Or did knowing the future actually affect it and changed it? For example, after learning that he was definitely going to survive, Sunny might have naturally relaxed and lowered his guard. Then he would die as the result of it. It surely seemed possible, right? That's assuming that the future could be changed, but maybe it wasn't. Then, feeling his head hurting, Sunny decided to avoid this line of thought for now. Instead, he hid his inner turmoil and said in a friendly tone, "That's a good ability. Speaking of abilities, you have already seen mine. My shadow can move independently and explore. It can't affect the material world, but we share sight and hearing. That way, I can spot danger before encountering it. The shadow is fast and stealthy. It can go anywhere and is almost impossible to notice. Oh, I can also see in the dark." He smiled, expecting the girls to understand and appreciate the utility of his shadow scout. Their reaction, however, was a bit strange. Naphis slowly turned her head in his direction, while Cassie became a bit pale and raised her hands to cover her chest. What?" Naphis frowned and said in a flat tone, "Have you ever used your ability in the academy?" Sunny blinked. What a strange question. "In the academy? Sure, of course. Why?" "Oh, right, they think that I'm a pervert. Crap." Before the girls could say anything, he hurriedly raised his hand and blurted, "But I have never used it to do anything improper. You have to believe me." Fortunately, it was the honest truth. However, both Naphis and Cassie looked skeptical. Sunny gritted his teeth. "I had more important things to do than whatever you're thinking about. I spent almost every waking hour learning how to survive." Naphis raised an eyebrow. "I haven't seen you in class, even once." Sunny chuckled. "Of course you didn't. While you were busy wiping the floor with other sleepers, I was studying wilderness survival." It was Changing Star's turn to blink. "Wilderness what? There is such a course." Cassie seemed equally puzzled. "Yes, there is. It might seem like an afterthought for most people, but for an outskirts kid like me, who never went to a fancy school or saw a private tutor, learning how to survive in the wilderness is the difference between life and death. Without it, I would have drowned the moment we were sent to the dream realm." On a rare occasion, Naphis looked completely bewildered. She rubbed her wrists and stared thoughtfully in his direction. "I see. I didn't know." Sunny grimaced and struggled to keep the venom from sipping into his voice. When he finally spoke, his tone was light and amiable. "That's okay. It's natural for someone of your status not to know." When he mentioned her status, a strange smile appeared on the Changing Star's face. But in the end, she didn't reply. Sunny continued, "Anyway, that's my ability. As for memories, I have 3. One is an armor, one is a sword, and the last one is a really loud bell." Now it was their turn to share. After a short pause, Naphis spoke. "My attributes give me an affinity to light and fire, as well as a strong affiliation to divinity. I have 2 memories, a rope." While she was speaking, Sunny was looking at Cassie, trying to read her expression. From what he saw, Naphis was telling the truth but also not the whole truth. And judging by how hard the blind girl was trying to hide her true feelings, the secret hiding among Changing Star's attributes was not at all trivial. Interesting. And a sword. The rope is very sturdy and can change its length. The sword is very sharp and can protect its wielder against soul's attacks, to a certain extent. My ability can be used to heal. Sunny didn't miss the wording of the last part. Can be used to heal. Does this mean that its main purpose was something else? He was pretty sure that Naphis would not reveal all of her cards, just like him. However, healing abilities were extremely rare. Having one that could heal, but was not limited to healing, that would be simply unheard of. But then again, she was Changing Star, one of the few people in history to receive a true name in the first nightmare. If Sunny were to consider his own aspect ability, nothing seemed impossible. I wonder what's her aspect rank is. Outwardly, he pretended to be excited. "You're a healer. That's great. Having a healer among us is incredible luck." Cassie nodded and smiled. "Neff is also an amazing fighter. You should have seen her dealing with those scavengers." "Well, I also did not actually see it, but it sounded very scary." Sunny didn't need anyone to tell him how formidable of a warrior Naphis was. He had seen it with his own 2 eyes, sort of. Actually, they were his shadow's eyes. Well, whatever it had instead of eyes. Meanwhile, Cassie sighed. "It's my turn. My attributes are nothing special. I guess I have an affinity to revelations and fate. My ability is like I told you before. It's not very useful. About my memories, I have three. The bottle, the wooden staff, and this armor. You already know about the bottle. The staff can create wind. The armor is actually of the awakened rank. Neff gave it to me when we met. It has a very powerful protective charm. So, she's not only carrying Cassie on her back, she even gave away her only clothes. An awakened rank armor at that. What is Naphis thinking about? The blind girl turned away and added after a while. I used to be a pretty decent fencer before. Now I can't really fight. The last two sentences were obviously related to her flaw. Sunny and Naphis, however, both chose to keep their secret, despite the fact that knowing your companion's flaw was also important for cooperation and having each other's backs. Sharing something like that demanded a very high level of trust. Right now, there was no trust between them, and even if there was, Sunny did not plan to ever share his flaw with anyone. Naphis too seemed to have a lot of secrets. After a while he said, "Good, that's good. I think we have enough tools to survive, provided we use them right. I guess it's time to sleep." In the darkness, Naphis tilted her head, listening to his words with a distant look. "All right, I will take watch first." Sunny decided to be helpful and said, "Actually, my shadow doesn't sleep. It can wake us up if something happens." Changing Star slowly smiled. "I will take watch first." Feeling a bit of coldness in her voice, Sunny sighed and shrugged. "Suit yourself. What are you going to watch, huh? You can't even see anything." "Whatever. Just don't blame me when something giant swallows us in the middle of the night." Then he suddenly shuddered. "Wait, that was not a death flag, right?" "Right, of course not. No way." Sleep was avoiding Sunny. For a while, he sat silently in the darkness, listening to the calming rumbling of the waves. In this rare moment of respite, memories of the past few days came flooding into his mind. However, he was too tired to seriously think about anything. He was warm, full, and relatively safe. For now, that was more than enough. Soon, the rhythm of Cassia's breathing changed, indicating that she fell asleep. Naphis was guarding the camp, motionless and as always a bit distant. With her silver hair and fair skin, she looked like an alabaster statue. Sunny sighed. He struggled for a bit and then said quietly, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" Naphis glanced at him and shrugged. The lack of an audible response clearly indicated that she remembered about his ability to see in the dark. "Sure. Would it be too personal?" Sunny hesitated. "I thought you legacies come into the spell with a whole inherited arsenal of memories. I mean, that's supposed to be your main advantage. How come you only had three?" Naphis was silent for a few moments. "Actually, I only had two. The rope came from Cassie." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I see." Realizing that her answer wasn't really an answer, Naphis thought for a while and added, "We lost most of our memories when my father passed away. The ones that remained were sold one by one over the years to keep the family afloat. This sword and armor came from my first nightmare. So that's how it was." Sunny realized that the fall of the immortal Flame clan might have been more thorough than he had thought. Still, something about it didn't make sense. Surely, with your clan's reputation and standing, there were other ways to make money. Without any strong reaction, Naphis simply said, "There were other reasons." Then, she unexpectedly turned her head in his direction. "Can I ask you a question in return?" Sunny swallowed. "Yeah, go ahead." Naphis tilted her head. "How did you know that I'm a legacy?" "What? That's it. Simple. I heard Castor mention it. He was scolding other sleepers to make them treat you with respect." She gave him a nod and turned away. What thoughts were hidden behind her calm gray eyes, Sunny did not know. Some time had passed before he gathered enough courage to ask the question that he really wanted to ask. Before doing it, though, he made sure that Cassie was sound asleep and lowered his voice. "Can I ask another question?" Without getting a negative response, he continued, "Why are you burdening yourself with her?" A corner of Changing Star's mouth curled up slightly. "Why wouldn't you?" Sunny gritted his teeth, feeling the flaw pushing the truthful answer out of his mouth. No. To be honest, he wanted to believe to the last moment that the answer would be yes. But one of the things he had lost after the nightmare was the ability to lie to himself. Truth was merciless. It's not that Sunny did not pity the blind girl or didn't want to help her. It's just that he knew with certainty that it was simply not something he could do. He was barely able to save himself, let alone carry a helpless person across the dream realm. If he tried, they would just die together. Still, he couldn't help but be a little disappointed in himself. Nephis, however, did not seem to judge him. She showed no reaction at all. After a few moments, she simply said, "Because I want to, because she wants to." That was not the response Sunny expected to hear. He was pretty sure that she would either lecture him about virtue and compassion or disclose some obscure way to make Cassie's seemingly weak ability incredibly useful. However, she did neither. Nephis expected him to believe that she was putting her life in danger, to the point of sacrificing an awakened armor-type memory, because that was something she simply wanted to do. Ridiculous. At first, he dismissed her response as a non-answer, but the more he thought about it, the more disturbed he felt, because maybe it was actually the truth. Due to the circumstances of his life, Sunny had never really done things because he wanted to. Most of the time, he was doing them because he needed to. It was never a question of want. It was always a question of must. For him, this was a basic rule of life. But was it really? Or was it just a matter of perspective? Nephis had certain advantages in her upbringing, but they weren't as ample as he had imagined. She had no wealth and no arsenal of relics to empower her. However, she did have a mentality that was different from Sunny's. It wasn't impossible for her to have the audacity to disregard need in favor of something as frivolous as desire, and do things that a normal person like Sunny would never do, like helping a blind girl simply because that was what Nephis wanted to do. Perhaps that mentality was the greatest advantage of all. Perhaps that was the real barrier that separated legacies from the rest of them. That was a lot to think about. However, before Sunny could gather his thoughts, Nephis suddenly spoke again. "My turn." Does she mean it's her turn to ask a question? Indeed, that was what she meant. Changing Star once again turned to Sunny, and after a long pause, suddenly asked, "Do you know the legend of Odysseus?" "A what? Who? What sort of a weird question is that?" Bewildered, Sunny shook his head. Then, remembering that she couldn't see him, he said, "No." Nephis sighed and turned away. A few moments later, she softly said, "Odysseus was a hero in an ancient war. In the legends, some humans back then had powers akin to the awakened. Achilles with an aspect of indestructible body. Diomedes that was so ferocious even the god of war was wary of him. Ajax who was as strong as a giant. Odysseus was not the strongest and not the bravest. However, he was the most cunning." Sunny blinked, staring at the silver-haired girl. "What? Where did this come from? Why is she suddenly so eloquent?" Meanwhile, Nephis continued. "In the end, Odysseus' cunning ended the war, and he prepared to sail home. However, the gods cursed him to endlessly wander the seas, never to return. Over the years, he survived one horror after another and lost all of his companions. Then, shipwrecked, he found himself on an island where the beautiful fairy Calypso lived. Changing Star's ethereal, strangely wistful voice resounded in the darkness, creating an enthralling atmosphere. Sunny couldn't help but listen with the utmost attention. Calypso fell in love with Odysseus and invited him to her palace. For many years, they lived together in harmony. The island was like a paradise, filled with all kinds of wonders, delicacies, and delights. As long as loving Calypso was by his side, Odysseus was even immortal. But the longer he stayed, the more time he spent sitting on the shore, looking at the sea with bleak eyes. Nephis smiled. In the end, Odysseus built a makeshift boat and abandoned the island, leaving all its delights, the beautiful fairy, and even his immortality behind. So my question is, why did he leave? Sunny blinked. What kind of a mind game was that? He even considered that Nephis was mocking him, but it didn't seem to be the case. It looked like she was sincerely interested in the answer. Weirdo. He thought for a bit, and then said without too much conviction, maybe it was because he was far away from home. A fleeting smile appeared on Nephis' face. Far away from home, all right. After that, she turned away and lowered her head, becoming like a statue again. It seemed like their conversation was over. Grumbling internally, Sunny lay down and tried to fall asleep. However, the image of bleak-eyed Odysseus kept appearing in his mind. After a while, he whispered, "Well, did he make it back home?" Soon Nephis replied, "Yes." He returned to his wife and son, and they lived happily ever after. Satisfied, Sunny smiled and turned on his side. When he was already half asleep, he heard Changing Star's quiet voice once again. This time it was barely audible and aimless, as though not directed at anyone. Odysseus was the first human to break the will of gods. In the morning, Sunny and Nephis were the first to get up. While the sun was rising and the sea was retreating, they made a fire and began preparing a simple breakfast. With Cassia still asleep, they did not talk to each other much. It was like the last night's conversation did not happen. However, after some time, they somehow ended up discussing the plan for the next few days. Nephis had some ideas. With what you told us about scavengers crowding to the west, the logical step would be to start moving east as soon as we can. Of course, north and south are also acceptable, but that won't put as much space between us and the enemy. Sunny nodded, agreeing with that logic. We have explored to the east a little, but not enough to confidently make it to the next high point in a day. That's why the best course of action would be to spend today scouting a path to that group of cliffs over there and move the camp tomorrow. He sighed. Do you have any idea where we are? Would there be a human citadel to the east? Nephis shook her head. I've never heard of a region that fits the characteristics of this place. In any case, we have to move to find out more. We will either find a citadel, encounter an unconquered gateway, or die. East is as good of a direction as any. Plus, it's the safest, because there's a horde of monsters to the west. At that point, Cassie suddenly sat up straight. Her eyes were wide open and her face was a little pale. She looked nervous and excited. Nephis frowned. Cassie, what's the matter? The blind girl turned to them and smiled. A vision. I had a vision. Like a prophetic dream. Sunny thought, trying to come to terms with this new reality of someone being able to see the future, or the past. Meanwhile, Changing Star stretched her hand as though prepared to summon her sword. Are we in danger? Cassie energetically shook her head. No, it's not that, people. I saw a castle full of people. She smiled and pointed with her finger. I don't know how far it is, but I'm sure that it's in that direction. Sunny and Nephis looked at each other, not knowing whether to be glad or petrified. Cassie's small, delicate finger was confidently pointing west. In the ensuing silence, the smile slowly disappeared from Cassie's face, replaced by confusion. Feeling the sudden tension, she asked, what's wrong? Sunny sighed. No, nothing is wrong. It's just that direction is the one we wanted to avoid. After some thought, he added, that's where I came from yesterday. There's a lot of scavengers down there. The blind girl's face fell. Oh. Nephis, who was quietly listening to them, gave him an indecipherable look and finally spoke. Tell us more about the castle. A shadow of the previous excitement returned to Cassie's eyes. With a serious nod, she began describing her vision. I dreamt of a vast, ruined city built of weathered stone. It was surrounded by tall, impregnable walls. Various monsters were wandering its narrow streets. In the center of the city there was a hill, and on that hill stood a magnificent castle. She smiled. But there were no monsters in the castle. Instead, it was full of people, I think. No, I'm sure that they were awakened. Some were guarding the walls, some were going about their lives without a care in the world. There was food, safety, and laughter. Well, that sounds great. If this castle really existed, then all of their problems would be solved. Sunny cleared his throat. Did you see anything else? Cassie frowned, trying to remember. Then her face cleared. Yes, I saw Sunny leading me through the gates of the castle. That means we will make it. A brilliant smile appeared on her doll-like face, beaming with so much joy that Sunny couldn't help but curl his lips. Inwardly, however, he was stuck on a certain detail of Cassie's vision. It was that, when talking about reaching the castle, the blind girl only mentioned the two of them. Was there some meaning behind it? Sunny turned his head a little and secretly glanced at Nephis, trying to discern if she had picked up on that little discrepancy. 2. Changing Star, however, was as enigmatic as ever. Without showing much emotion, she thought for a while and then slowly nodded. Okay, then we will go west. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. While the sea was still retreating, they had their breakfast and then spent some time planning for the journey and preparing to abandon the temporary camp. In the process, Sunny had a chance to get to know the girls a little better. It was then that he came to a sudden realization, which almost made his head explode from bafflement. That mind-blowing realization had to do with Nephis. Back when they first met in front of the academy's gates, Sunny had formed a certain impression of the confident, distant girl. Later, her behavior and the different revelations about changing stars past only served to reinforce that impression. Nephis seemed to exist a bit apart from the world. She was mysterious, aloof, and rather cool. Her taciturn character and strange speech patterns made people interacting with her feel unnerved and rattled, often revealing more than they had been planning to. The less she talked, the more she seemed to know. That silent, indifferent confidence was arresting and sometimes even oppressive. However, that impression turned out to be completely wrong. The actual truth behind the matter had nothing to do with being cool and aloof. After talking to her a bit more and observing their interactions with Cassie, Sunny almost fainted when he realized that Nephis was simply an incredibly, ridiculously, painfully awkward person. It was as though she had no idea how to talk to people. Every time she tried to convey something, she would either use the wrong words or stumble in the middle of the sentence and fall silent. Her tone never matched what she was trying to say. Often, she would forget to put correct intonations in her speech, making questions sound like statements or vice versa. Added to that was the fact that, like many introverted people, Nephis was not in a habit of openly showing her emotions. It's not that she didn't have feelings. It's just that she was really bad at emoting them. As a result, her face always looked cold and neutral. That's why, most of the time, she simply chose to talk as little as possible or not to talk at all. All of that added up together, then multiplied by her general weirdness, was ultimately responsible for creating the false image of a mysterious, unapproachable ice princess, when in fact she was just shy and completely inept in communicating with people. After coming to that realization, Sunny tried with all his might, but still failed to stop himself from staring at Nephis with wide eyes. He just barely managed to not let his jaw hang open. What the hell? That's not in line with how a protagonist should be. In his mind, Nephis had definitely been the type of person to be the main character of any event. At the center stage, there were always confident, strong people like her and Castor. People like himself and Cassie, on the other hand, were relegated to exist far away in the background. Now, however, no, that line of thought was also wrong. The fact that Changing Star had problems with expressing herself and lacked social skills did not mean that she was not strong. In fact, it might have meant the opposite. She still achieved everything that she had achieved, but with the added layer of adversity. She was still dangerous. At that moment, Nephis finally noticed that Sunny was staring at her. She looked at him and after a long pause asked in an emotionless tone, "What?" He blinked, extricating himself from this sudden flood of thoughts, and cleared his throat. Nothing. I was just going to ask, when are we setting off?" Nephis appeared to be thinking. After a while she turned away and said, "Soon." You really can't manage more than one word, can you?" Utterly bewildered, Sunny hid his emotions and smiled. "Ah, all right then." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the gray light of morning, they abandoned the tall hill and ventured west, retracing their steps from yesterday. Knowing the path, the small party made quick progress. Nephis was walking in front, her sword arm ready to strike at any moment. A bit behind her was Sunny. This time, the responsibility of holding the golden rope and guiding Cassie along was entrusted to him. Of course, the actual creature, leading them was his shadow. It scouted ahead, carefully observing the labyrinth for signs of danger. The labyrinth was just as it was before, confusing and seemingly endless. Crimson blades of coral protruded from the black mud, creating a vast, tangled forest. However, today something about it felt different. It wasn't long before the shadow stumbled onto a mass of hulking, hungry scavengers. "Halt," Sonny whispered, observing the group of scavengers through his shadow. As soon as the word left his lips, Nephis immediately summoned her sword. After studying the surroundings for a second, she turned her head and glanced at him with a question in her eyes. Cassia, meanwhile, froze in place and hesitantly raised her staff. Sonny counted the monsters. 1, 2, 3, 5. Curses. The hulking beasts seemed like the losers of the pack, similar to the one he had killed. However, their wounds were not as pronounced and terrible. Each of them was much more of a threat than the mangled one from before, and there were half a dozen of them at least. "There are scavengers on the path ahead, 6 of them. They're slowly moving in our direction." Nephis cast a gaze forward. There was a calculating look on her face. "They're done with the carcass." Sonny thought for a moment and then shook his head. "No, I don't think so. But maybe there's not enough meat for everyone anymore." So some stragglers had no choice but to leave with an empty stomach. Nephis nodded and gestured to a nearby branching path. "We will circle around them." The 3 sleepers hastily moved forward and changed paths, giving a wide berth to the group of monsters. Tense and grim, they continued walking, trying to stay on course and not get lost in the labyrinth. However, in the next hour, they had to turn in a random direction again and again, avoiding other scavengers. The distance between them and the giant statue was not shortening at all. At some point, they were catching their breath near one of the numerous dead ends of the Crimson Labyrinth. They had no choice but to wait, since a large number of creatures was moving past their hiding spot, separated from them by a long length of a twisting coral passage. Sonny sighed and shook his head. "We can't go on like that. At this rate, we will never make it to safety before sunset." Cassie was the first one to react. Maybe we should turn back." That was a reasonable suggestion. However, Sonny felt reluctant to agree. Nephis shared his thoughts. With a blank expression, she said, "It will only get harder tomorrow." She was right. By tomorrow, there would be even more scavengers flooding the labyrinth. Then, what should we do? Changing Star tilted her head, thinking. After a while, she turned to Sonny. "Fight. Fight against dozens of those monstrosities." Was she crazy? Sonny tried to hide his derision as he spoke. "I know that you are skilled with the sword, but have you forgotten that each of those things is a whole rank above us? We won't survive in a fight against many." Nephis nodded. "We avoid large groups, cut down smaller ones." After a moment, she added, "If there's 1 or 2 of them, there's a chance." Sonny wanted to retort but couldn't find a good reason. In the end, he gave up. "Fine." Nephis stared at him for a while. Then she suddenly asked, "Have you studied the corpse of the scavenger you had killed?" What was that supposed to mean? A bit surprised, Sonny shook his head. No, he was too busy being in pain and trying to make it to safety before the sea returned. And why would he study a corpse? Wait, I think Teacher Julius mentioned something. After a short pause, Nephis spoke. "Scavengers have 3 weak points on their bodies. The first one is obvious. It's their joints. Anything that has to be flexible can't be too rigid. So there's gaps in the armor above the joints. By targeting the joints, you can diminish their mobility and attack capacity. Oh, so by studying a dead monster, one could better understand their strengths and vulnerabilities." This idea was so obvious that Sonny admonished himself for not realizing sooner. Meanwhile, Nephis continued. "The second one is the same. It's where their torso connects to the carapace. If you manage to accurately hit that spot, you can heavily injure a scavenger and deal serious damage to its body. However, unless you succeed in severing its spine, the wound won't be fatal. It will still be able to fight for a while." Sonny couldn't help but notice that Changing Star's awkwardness seemed to disappear whenever she talked about things that she felt confident about, like ancient heroes or killing things. Curious, the last weak point is on their back, approximately at the level where the eyes are. There's a slightly concave, discolored cavity in their armor. It is where several armor plates connect. The chitin there is comparatively thin. If you can pierce through it, you can destroy the brain directly. That will be a killing blow. That is good to know. However, that weak point was too high to be hit by a human after all. Scavengers were more than 2 meters tall. As though reading his thoughts, Naphis added, "That weak point is very hard to target. Circling around a scavenger is almost impossible due to their size, speed, and the attack range of their pincers." She looked at him and calmly said, "If we stumble on a single scavenger, I will be the bait. My task will be to make it turn around and then restrain it, exposing the third weak point. Your task will be to kill it." Sunny gulped. "What if there's two of them?" As usual, Naphis paused before answering, "Don't die." It wasn't long before they were left with no choice but to attempt a fight against a scavenger. Behind them, there was a long stretch of the labyrinth with no suitable branching paths for them to turn onto. Ahead of them, there was a small clearing with only one other passage leading out of it. Not far into that passage, a massive scavenger was moving slowly in their direction. Sunny quickly described the situation and waited for Changing Star's feedback. Without much delay, she gave him a nod. "We fight in the clearing." After that, Naphis gently guided Cassie to the wall of the labyrinth and helped her find a place to sit. "Wait here, we will be back." After some thought, she added, "Soon." As Naphis moved to walk away, Cassie grabbed her hand. Her face was pale and tense. "Nephew, be careful, okay?" Naphis blinked and tilted her head a little, then she smiled. Sure." With that, she and Sunny hastily headed for the clearing. By the time they got there, the scavenger was seconds from appearing. Sunny's shadow flew out of the passage and reattached itself to his feet. Without having to discuss things with Naphis, he quickly hid in the shadows and waited there, hoping for a chance to attack. Naphis, on the other hand, strolled to the center of the clearing and calmly stood there, her shoulders relaxed and her back straight. An elegant longsword appeared in her hands, carelessly pointed to the ground. Not knowing what else to do, Sunny silently repeated her words, "Don't die." A second later, the scavenger walked into the clearing. When his tiny eyes spotted Naphis, an evil light ignited in them. Without wasting even a second, the massive monster screeched and rushed forward to attack. Its huge pincer shot forward with terrifying speed, tearing the air in its path. Naphis swiftly sidestepped, dodging the pincer, then leaped backward, removing herself from the path of the rushing monster. Simultaneously, her sword flashed in the air, cutting deep into the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs. Azure blood spattered on the ground. Of course, this small wound was too insignificant to slow the scavenger down. With surprising agility, it twisted and delivered a crushing sideways swipe. Naphis, who just barely landed on her feet, had no choice but to deflect the blow with her sword. She managed to disperse most of the impact by holding the blade at the right angle, but the remaining force was still enough to throw her off balance. At that moment, the second pincer came down. Instead of trying to regain her equilibrium, Changing Star went with the fall and somersaulted over one hand, ending up distancing herself from the monster a bit. Her sword lashed out again. The follow-up attack followed almost immediately. However, Sunny did not care about the details anymore. The only thing he cared about was that, through this risky series of dodges and leaps, Naphis had managed to circle to the opposite side of the clearing, forcing the scavenger to turn its back to the shadow in which he hid. "It's now or never." Gritting his teeth, Sunny lunged forward, before Changing Star finished her last dodge, before the scavenger's pincer crashed on her from above, before Sunny had time to become scared. He closed the distance between himself and the monster and jumped with all his might, landing on top of its carapace. Then he used all of his weight to thrust a hand forward. Azure blade shimmered into existence in his grip and was immediately swallowed by the shadow. A breath later, the dark blade hit precisely into the concave, discolorated cavity in the scavenger's armor. With a crack, the chitin broke, allowing the tip of the sword to sink deep into the scavenger's body. The monster shuddered and then heavily fell to the ground. Sunny was thrown from its carapace, landing in the mud with a roll. That easy. It was already over. As though to answer him, the spell's voice resounded in the air. "You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger." Sunny was sprawled in the mud, looking at the sky. He didn't even have to catch his breath, since the whole fight took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. No one was dead, wounded, or even bruised. Well, with the exception of the scavenger, it was completely out of his expectations. He glanced at the monster's corpse to make sure that it was actually dead, then summoned the runes, and took a look at the number of shadow fragments in his possession. Shadow fragments, 16 out of 1,000. It was actually true. The mighty awakened beast perished just like that. And although Nephis did most of the work, he was the one to deal the killing blow. Why can't it always be so easy? Sunny got back on his feet and dismissed the azure blade. Then he remembered the words Master Jet had once told him. No one can survive in the dream realm alone. Back then, he noted her advice, but didn't really believe it. After all, he had always strived to be self-sufficient, not allowing himself to depend on anyone. In Sunny's mind, this was the true meaning of strength. However, now he was beginning to suspect that this logic was flawed. Indeed, having someone to share your burdens meant the difference between heaven and hell here in the dream realm. If he was alone, fighting against a single scavenger might have been the end of him. Similarly, even though Nephis was far more skilled than Sunny, it would have been extremely hard for her to defeat the armored monster alone, being that its weakest point was out of her reach. But together, they had accomplished it with relative ease. The whole was greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, there was strength in numbers that surpassed individual power. In that sense, being able to depend on a group was not a sign of weakness, but, on the contrary, an important facet of personal strength. Lone wolves would always be at a disadvantage. That was another lesson to learn. It's not like I had much of a choice. He walked over to Nephis and checked if she was okay. Apart from slight damage to her makeshift seaweed clothes, everything seemed to be all right. She glanced at Sunny. Memory? He shook his head. Nephis sighed. It seemed that she was a bit impatient to get herself a suit of armor of her own. If Sunny was a gentleman, he would have suggested to loan her the puppeteer's shroud for a while. But alas, he wasn't. That armor was extremely valuable, and had cost him a lot. Plus, unlike Changing Star, the picture of Sunny wearing nothing but a seaweed loincloth would have been more disturbing than aesthetically pleasing. So, he said nothing. Meanwhile, Nephis headed for the dead scavenger and said without turning her head, "Bring Cassie." With a sigh, Sunny turned around and left the clearing. Soon, he approached the place where the blind girl was waiting patiently for their return. Hearing his footsteps, she flinched and raised her head. Sunny. How did she recognize me? Must be the way I walk. Yeah, it's me. Everything is over. Come on, I will bring you to Nephis. Using the wooden staff, Cassie stood up and turned to him. Are you guys all right? Sunny smiled. Of course, we dispatched that critter in no time. Didn't even get a scratch. Cassie smiled with visible relief. Good, that's good. Oh right, the rope. Sunny took the rope and guided the blind girl back to the clearing. On the way, he felt a bit weird. With the delicate girl walking behind him, he couldn't help but think of his little sister. As a toddler, she used to follow him around too, as though they were glued together. As the familiar pain stabbed him in the heart, Sunny gritted his teeth and tried to think about something else. It was all in the past anyway. Back in the clearing, Nephis was done breaking apart the scavenger's carapace. The shimmering soul shard was already in her hand. Without saying anything, she tossed it to Sunny. He caught the crystal and looked at her with surprise. Why are you giving it to me? Nephis blinked and stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then she said as a matter of fact, I don't have pockets. Oh, still a bit bewildered. Sunny put the soul shard into his rucksack. But why wouldn't she just absorb it? He opened his mouth to ask the question, but she seemed to realize something and added, we will divide the spoils later. All right. Nephis, meanwhile, turned to Cassie and said after some deliberation, I was careful. Then she smiled. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Your shadow grows stronger. Sunny was feeling somewhere in between of being ecstatic and peeved. Throughout the day, they managed to kill 3 more scavengers, each time with not much risk to anyone except for Nephis. The process was largely the same. After discovering the monster, he would hide in the shadows, while Nephis would act as bait. Then, when the time was right, Sunny would stealthily approach and finish the fight with a precise strike of the azure blade. He was wondering if that was what being in the main hero's party felt like. To anyone else, maybe with the exception of Castor, dancing around a deadly awakened beast would have been a tall task, most likely ending with the dancer's death. Nephis, however, had managed to do it over and over again seemingly without too much strain. What's more, her performance was based solely on skill, with no aspect ability involved. In that regard, even Castor couldn't have done better. She was swift, calm, and precise. Every move she made was calculated and perfectly timed. She seemed to innately understand the flow and logic of combat, which gave her the ability to roughly predict what actions the mindless beasts would perform in the next seconds. Then it was just the question of physical prowess to evade and even manipulate them to a certain degree. Sunny had always known that skill and experience were more important than raw power, but by watching Nephis, he vividly understood just how vast the difference between them was. Even though his divine aspect allowed Sunny to exert more strength and speed than Changing Star, in an actual fight, he would never stand a chance. Of course, he was also an important part of every encounter. His role as the finisher was not trivial, and not just anybody would have been able to accomplish 4 kills with 4 strikes. Even though Sunny was not taught any elaborate techniques, he was still a somewhat experienced fighter. He had good physical coordination, combat intuition, and most importantly, a cool-headed mentality. Not to mention the fact that they were only able to ambush the scavengers so effectively due to his shadow scouting them out in advance. All in all, it was an almost equal cooperation. Still, watching Nephis fight was nothing short of sobering. Trying not to get too dejected, Sunny summoned the runes. Shadow fragments, 22 out of 1,000, 8 fragments today. Pretty excellent. Currently, they were waiting on the edge of the labyrinth path, leading directly to the giant statue of the Headless Knight. There was a group of scavengers between them and the statue, moving past without any haste. The sunset was near, but they still had time. Slowly, minutes flowed by. At some point, Nephis gave the command to move, helping Cassie along. Sunny followed Changing Star and quickly traversed the open space between the labyrinth and the statue. Now they only had to get on top of it. However, it wasn't that easy. Scaling the 200-meter-tall monument would have been hard in normal circumstances. But now, they also had to somehow pull Cassie up. Leaving her behind until they were at the top would not have been safe. In the end, Nephis and Sunny took turns pulling the rope every 20 meters or so. Cassie would hold onto the rocks and wait until they climbed higher, and then the process would repeat. It was slow and torturous, and by the end, Sunny's muscles were sore and almost on fire. But they managed to get to safety before the dark waters washed them away. As the night began to descend, the 3 sleepers sat in the center of the circular stone platform and rested. As they did not bring any materials to make a fire, and it was already too late, there was no way to cook food. They ended up chewing on the strips of dried meat, passing the bottle of limitless water around. After some time, Nephis gave Sunny a sign to take out the spoils of today's journey. He took out the 4 shimmering soul shards and put them on the ground. Without any discussion, Changing Star moved 2 crystals in his direction and took 2 for herself. Then she gave one of hers to Cassie. Sunny watched it in silence. By the time Nephis and Cassie had absorbed their soul shards, he still didn't make a move to take his. After a while, he took another crystal out of the rucksack and moved all 3 to Nephis. The silver-haired girl looked at him with surprise. "Don't you want to grow stronger?" Sunny grinned. "Of course I do. But these won't do me much good right now. It's no secret that you are the main fighting force of our group." He sighed. "The stronger you are, the better our chances of survival will get. Plus, it's not a gift, it's a trade." Nephis raised an eyebrow. "A trade? What do you want?" Sunny deliberated for a few seconds before answering. "It's rather simple. I will give you these soul shards, and all other soul shards I earn on the way to that castle. Then," he looked her in the eyes and said, "in return, you will teach me how to fight." Nephis looked at him and contemplated. This time, She remained silent longer than usual. Sunny felt a bit nervous under her gaze, knowing that he was being evaluated. With changing stars, skill, and insight, it wasn't hard to imagine just how much she had gleaned from his battle performance. Both his current level and future potential must have been pretty much laid bare in front of her. Were they enough to make teaching him worth her while? After some time, she took the soul shards and nodded. Okay. Sunny smiled, congratulating himself on a successful deal. Not only did he receive a lot while not losing much, but he had also managed to create a bit of a favorable impression of himself in the eyes of Nephis and Cassie. As far as performances went, this was a great one. So when do we start? Nephis shrugged. Now. Sunny glanced at the sun, which was already almost gone. Were they going to train in complete darkness? It wasn't really an obstacle for him. Changing star, however. We will start with some words. That will be enough for today. After hesitating a little, she added, Cassie, you listen too. Sunny and Cassia turned to Nephis, listening to her like two obedient students. Despite the fact that their age was more or less similar, both knew that, in terms of martial prowess, their companion had authority that was as beyond theirs as a dragon's might was beyond that of a worm. Nephis thought for a while and then said, Mastery of combat can be divided into two aspects. One is body and the other one is mind. Training the body is not easy, but it is rather simple. All you need is repetition and experience. In a fight, things happen too fast to consider every detail in the moment. That's why your technique must exist in your muscles and bones, so much so that it almost becomes an instinct. She paused. You can achieve initial results through repetition. Then, it must be cemented through experience. The more battle experience you have, the deeper a technique will be assimilated into your body. There is no other way. 1,000 hours of training won't be as impactful as one real fight. Only those who survive countless battles can be truly in command of the body. That simultaneously made a lot of sense and no sense at all. On the one hand, the principle of improving through practice was quite logical. On the other hand, Changing Star's statement made it seem like all those lofty legacies, with their years of training, were nothing but harmless children. After all, no matter how good their tutors were, they had no real battle experience. But then again, she did wipe the floor with every one of them excluding Castor with no apparent difficulty. So maybe her statement was true. That, however, posed a question of its own. Just what kind of life had Nephis led to possess rich battle experience at the tender age of 18? Should I stop calling her princess? Meanwhile, Nephis continued. Training the mind, however, is not simple at all. That is because, once you reach a certain level of skill, the mind is where the true combat takes place. The outcome is often decided before your body begins to move. And to master the mind, the first step is to understand the essence of combat. However, very few people truly do. She looked at them and asked, What do you think that essence is? Sunny hesitated. The essence of combat, what might it be? If it was some other legacy, he would have been tempted to say something stupid like honor, valor, or duty. But he already knew that Nephis did not fit into the image of a noble aristocrat he had in his mind. She wasn't someone who followed empty words. After a minute or so, Cassie finally answered, Victory. And almost at the same time, Sunny said, Survival. Changing Star shook her head. No. Then she rubbed her neck and pierced them with a cold, fierce gaze. The essence of combat is murder. Cassie flinched and opened her eyes wide. Sunny frowned a little. Nephis, however, did not seem to care. In the same calm tone, she continued, At the core of it, there is only this. You are trying to kill your opponent, and they are trying to kill you. In the end, one of you will be killed, and the other one will be the killer. Everything else is just noise. Her words sank deep into Sunny's heart and reverberated there, causing something inside of him to resonate and awaken. Style doesn't matter. Weapons don't matter. Reason and intent do not matter. The only thing that matters is to be the last one standing. In this way, anything you do in combat must be viewed as only serving one of two purposes, either to kill your enemy or to prevent the enemy from killing you. Nephis lowered her eyes. If you can understand that, you will have enough clarity to master the mind. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. After that, Sunny couldn't fall asleep for a long while. He lay on the cold stone, looking into the darkness and thinking about what Naphis had taught them. Repetition, experience, clarity. These were the three keys to becoming a fearsome warrior. All three were important, but the last one was the most vexing. Was it really how Changing Star had said? Was there nothing at the core of being a warrior than a cold will to kill? Intuitively, he felt that it was indeed so. This ruthless truth was, in a sense, an amalgamation of all his life experiences. After all, for someone like him, life was nothing but a constant battle for survival. Someone always won, and someone always lost. The former got to live for a few more days, the latter. No one cared what happened to them. Of course, life was life and combat was combat. To most people, they weren't one and the same. But what about the awakened? The sole purpose of their existence was to fight against the nightmare creatures. Very few could escape that fate. After coming to the academy, Sunny allowed himself to think that he had escaped the fate of always having to struggle at the edge of survival. But now it seemed like he had just exchanged one battle for another. This was an uncomfortable thought. However, if he looked at it from a different perspective, did it actually mean that he always had a crucial advantage? Most of those chosen by the spell were forced to somehow adjust to this merciless way of life. But he had always lived like this. Was he actually one of the few perfectly suited to be an awakened? With this thought, Sunny fell asleep. In the early morning, he was awakened by a piercing scream. Sunny was on his feet even before fully waking up. Somehow, Azure Blade was already in his hand. His shadow was hovering beside him, ready to either wrap itself around the sword, in case he needed to attack, or around his body, in case it was already too late for that. He tried to understand what was going on. Naphis was nearby, her longsword raised in a defensive stance. Cassie. Where's Cassie? Fearing what he might see giant tentacles reaching for them from the darkness, he looked around. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the first hints of dawn, adding a tiny shade of gray to the blackness of the world. In that blackness, there were no signs of danger. Finally, he saw Cassie. The blind girl was stumbling at the edge of the platform, with a horrified expression on her face. With her blonde hair in a mess, she was stretching her hands out, clearly lost in space. Of course, there were no walls for her to find. The platform was open to the elements, and the only thing waiting for Cassie was a plunge into the dark, tumultuous waters. Before Sunny knew what he was doing, he was already running. That wasn't a very smart thing to do after all. He did not know what had caused Cassia to scream, and if there was some hidden danger nearby. Plus, it was still too dark for Naphis to see. His sudden lunge could have caused her to lash out with the sword before asking questions. All of these were good reasons to wait and observe first. But in an uncharacteristic and completely irrational manner, Sunny acted before thinking. He caught Cassie moments before she took a step off the platform, and holding her tightly in his arms, dragged the blind girl back. "I got her," Sunny yelled, letting Changing Star know that there was no need to stab him with a sword. And then, in a quiet voice, he said to Cassie, "I got you, it's all right. Everything is fine. Calm down." He felt the girl's body trembling and looked around again, trying to understand what had scared her so much. But there was nothing. Naphis was listening to the sea for the same reason. After a few seconds, she asked, "Do you see anything?" Sunny helplessly shook his head. "No." He helped Cassie sit down in the center of the platform, while Naphis stood guard above them. He looked the blind girl over to make sure that there were no wounds on her body. Everything seemed to be fine. "She's not hurt anywhere." Changing Star looked down. Although her face remained indifferent, he could tell that she was a bit flustered. After a second or two, she asked in something that might have been her version of a calming tone. It sounded pretty much exactly the same as usual. "Cassie, what happened?" Magically, that did seem to calm the blind girl down a little, at least enough for her to speak in a quivering voice. Cassie extended one hand and pointed down. The head. "I saw." "Oh gods." Sunny frowned and looked at Naphis. Did she see a vision, the past? The tall girl was silent for a moment. "I don't know, it never happened before." Both of them turned to Cassie, not sure what to do. Since there was no apparent danger around, they took turns trying to calm the horrified girl down. However, after that one sentence, she fell quiet and refused to speak again. Nothing seemed to help. After a while, Naphis sighed. "Let's leave her be for now. Maybe she needs time." Sunny was about to retort, but truth be told, he didn't have any ideas either. In the end, he just nodded. "Okay, I will keep an eye on her." Changing Star, however, had other ideas. Asterisk, 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 as the sun was rising and the surging sea was receding, Naphis chose to give Cassie some space and led Sunny to the edge of the platform. However, she made sure to always have the blind girl in the periphery of her vision. Cassia sat hugging her knees. Her eyes were closed, but small tremors that periodically ran through her body betrayed that she was awake. Sunny's eye twitched. "Are you sure it's okay to leave her like this?" Naphis gave him a complicated look. "Yes." Then after some thought she added, "Cassie is strong." Sunny wasn't sure how to answer. If Changing Star considered someone to be strong, then they most likely were. However, strong was the last word that came to his mind when he thought about the delicate, beautiful, blind girl. Wasn't she someone who constantly needed their help? But then again, there were different kinds of strength. Cassia was still alive and sane despite her debilitating flaw. How many people could have done the same? If you say so. Then Naphis made him summon the azure blade. After studying it for a while, she nodded and took her longsword out of the air. Despite its size, it was an elegant weapon. The narrow, double-edged blade was much longer than that of the azure blade, with an incredibly sharp, symmetrical tip. The whole blade, as well as the simple cross-shaped guard and the pommel, seemed to be made out of silver and reflected the pale morning light. The handle was tightly wrapped in black leather. Putting the two swords side by side, Naphis spoke. "Your sword can be used with one hand, but its true potential can only be revealed when held in both. It is created primarily for cutting and severing, hence the higher center of gravity. However, it can thrust as well." Then she gestured to hers. "My sword is a bit more versatile. It is created for both cutting and thrusting, and it has a double edge. However, the principle of wielding these two swords is the same." She took the sword in both hands, placing one near the guard and another near the pommel. Then she performed a downward slash. They are both leverage-based weapons. When held with two hands, one hand pushes. She pushed the sword down with the hand near the guard, while the other hand pulls. The hand near the pommel simultaneously pulled the handle up, giving the blade a tremendous boost in speed. This is how you generate force and perform powerful strikes. "Now, your turn." Sunny looked at his sword and gripped it with both hands, mimicking Naphis' pose. Then he raised it and slashed down, making sure to enhance the force of the strike with his lower hand. Changing Star observed him. "You need to understand that a strike doesn't come from the hands. It comes from your whole body. Power comes from your feet, your hips, your core, your shoulders, and is only then transmitted to your hands. Like this." She demonstrated the downward slash again. This time, Sunny paid attention to the overall stance and movements of every part of Changing Star's body, as opposed to only the sword. He wasn't a novice to fighting. Instinctively, he already knew how to deliver a proper punch. Even if, before, there wasn't a lot of strength in his body, the principles of striking with a sword were largely the same, so Sunny quickly understood the overall concept. He performed the simple downward slash a few more times. After each time, Naphis gave him pointers and corrected his mistakes. Some time later, she was finally satisfied with his form. "Good." Sunny smiled, proud of his achievements. Naphis looked at him thoughtfully and nodded. "Now do it 1,000 more times." The smile froze on Sunny's face. 1,000. Did she say 1,000? He blinked. Sorry, how many times?" Changing Star tilted her head and thought for some time. "Well, we don't have much time today, so yes, only 1,000. Ha ha ha, only 1,000, eh?" Sunny forced himself to sound polite. "I see, all right." As Naphis walked back to sit with Cassie, he turned to the sea and raised his sword. 1. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. He raised it again. 2. Push and pull. This is how you generate force. 3. Strike with your whole body, not just your hands. 4. As Sunny raised his sword and slashed down, over and over again, only one thought eventually remained in his mind. Repetition, experience, clarity. Repetition. By the time he was done performing 1,000 strikes, Cassie was finally ready to speak. With pretty much every muscle in his body sore, Sunny walked over to the girls and fell on the ground. After catching his breath, he looked at Cassie. Cassie, do you feel better? Several seconds later, the blind girl slowly nodded. That's a relief. He shifted and hesitated for a bit. Cassie didn't look too well. Her face was still very pale, with a distant, dazed expression on it. Her body at least was no longer trembling. Sunny wasn't very good at talking to people, let alone placating them. He wasn't sure what to say. He cast a gaze at Nephis and sighed inwardly. Who knew that one day he would turn out to be the most sociable person for as far as the eye could see. What a joke. Can I have some water? Cassie turned to him and scowled, as though confused by the question. Then she suddenly gasped and opened her eyes wide. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course. She summoned the limitless water bottle and offered it to Sunny. He took it with a grateful smile and greedily drank a few gulps before giving the bottle to Nephis. Eventually, it returned to Cassie. You drink some too. After she did, he awkwardly patted the blind girl on the shoulder. Everything seems to be fine now. Did you dream of another vision? You can tell us. If you want. Cassie hesitated for a bit before saying, unknown. I don't know. Maybe it was just a nightmare. Sunny and Nephis exchanged glances. They both doubted that what Cassie saw was a simple nightmare. After all, people usually did not dream in the dream realm. The blind girl, meanwhile, continued. I don't really remember. It's all in fragments. Sunny carefully considered his words, not wanting to pressure Cassie too much. You can just tell us what you remember. Maybe we will be able to make sense of it together. Cassie sighed and tentatively nodded. After a long pause, she finally found the courage to speak. At first, I saw a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Something vast was churning in the darkness. I felt like if I directly saw it, I would lose my mind. As I watched, terrified, the seals broke one after another until only one remained. And then that seal broke too. She trembled a little. After that, I don't know. It was as though my mind shattered into 1,000 shards, each shard reflecting its own image. Most of them were dark and scary, some I have already forgotten. The other, Cassie fell silent, remembering. I saw the human castle again. Only this time it was at night. There was a lonely star burning in the black skies, and under its light, the castle was suddenly consumed by fire, with rivers of blood flowing down its halls. I saw a corpse in a golden armor sitting on a throne, a woman with a bronze spear drowning in a tide of monsters, an archer trying to pierce the falling sky with his arrows. Finally, she looked up, her face full of horror. In the end, I saw a colossal, terrifying crimson spire. At its base, 7 severed heads were guarding 7 locks, and at the top, a dying angel was being consumed by hungry shadows. When I saw the angel bleed, I suddenly felt as though something so precious that it can't be described with words was taken from me. Her voice became quieter. Then I felt so much sorrow, pain, and rage that what little remained of my sanity seemed to disappear. That was when I woke up, I think. Nephis and Sunny remained silent for a while, trying to make sense of what Cassie had told them. Even if Nephis had an idea, she didn't show it. Sunny, however, was totally lost. He couldn't even begin to decipher the hidden meaning behind the vision, if there even was one. Previously, Cassie's vision about the castle was pretty much straightforward. It showed her a human fortress, and even the direction in which it was situated. This time, however, her dream was disjointed, full of weird symbolism and vague, uncertain images, much more like a charlatan's prophecy than a vision gained through an aspect ability. Finally, he sighed. Maybe it actually was just a nightmare. Your previous visions weren't like this, right? Cassie silently shook her head. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Well, people don't usually dream in the dream realm, but you do. Perhaps seeing a random nightmare once in a while is a side effect of your ability. The blind girl turned to him. a faint relief written on her face. "You really think so?" He hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Why not? It's a possibility." Inwardly, however, he felt uneasy. A dying angel being consumed by shadows. Why does it sound so ominous? I should try and stay away from angels in the future. Gee, what has become of my life? A sentence like that doesn't even sound insane anymore. With that, they were finally ready to welcome a new day. Some time later, they were sitting on the western edge of the stone platform, looking at the scavengers below. Sunny's shadow was busy scouting a path to the next high landmark. Were there always that many? Sunny glanced at Nephis and shook his head. No, there were much more. They seemed to be almost done with the carcass. I doubt it will last until nightfall, which meant that, by tomorrow, all these beasts would be roaming the labyrinth, making it hard for the three sleepers to make any progress. It would be best to leave today and put some distance between themselves and the horde before the scavengers were done with their feast. However, without scouting a path in advance, there was a chance of not making it to safety in time. Both options were risky. Nephis frowned, seemingly thinking the same. After a while, she said, "I don't want Cassie to spend another night near this statue. Let's leave now." Sunny thought for a while, then opened his mouth to offer his own opinion. However, a sudden commotion below prevented him from speaking. Down at the bottom of the disappearing sea, amidst mounds of broken coral, the carcass of the giant shark-like monster, the remaining half of it, to be precise, was almost stripped of meat, and between its white bones something was shimmering in the mud. Two extremely large, luminescent crystals. Sunny's eyes widened. Are those? Yes, shards of two transcendent soul cores. Transcendent, two of them. Suddenly, he was simultaneously filled with greed and fear. Greed because of how rare and precious transcendent soul shards were. Fear because the giant shark turned to be a corrupted devil. At least, one corrupted devil, if not stopped by a saint or a large number of awakened, could potentially destroy an entire city. Sunny belatedly realized that he was much closer to death on that first night than he had previously thought. Should we await and listen? He stared at Nephis, and then obediently listened to the distant, barely audible clamor of the scavengers. After a while, he noticed some disharmony in it. Nephis suddenly tensed up. There, she pointed in the direction of the labyrinth. After concentrating on it, Sunny was finally able to notice two massive shadows stepping out of a particularly wide passage. A second later, the creatures casting those shadows appeared in sight. Sunny gulped. Damn, the monsters looked like the scavengers, but not quite. To start with, they were much larger, towering above the surroundings at more than 3 meters of height. Their carapace seemed to be thicker. It was colored in deep black and scarlet, like an ancient armor drenched in blood. Here and there, vicious-looking spikes were growing out of the carapace, making their every move much more dangerous. Additionally, instead of heavy pincers, their upper arms ended with long, curved, terrifying bone scythes. Sunny felt cold sweat running down his spine. What the hell are those things? Nephis tilted her head. Monsters, I guess. Nightmare creatures with one soul core were called beasts. They were dangerous and strong, but mindless. If they were able to develop or were created with a second core, they became monsters. Monsters were much more devastating and possessed some rudimentary, warped form of intelligence. They were the next step in a nightmare beast's evolution, and these two seemed to be bigger, deadlier versions of carapace scavengers. Sunny and Nephis watched as the two monsters approached the carcass. The scavengers were visibly afraid of them, rushing to get out of the way. Those who were too slow were mercilessly thrown to the side or cut apart by the bone scythes. Rivers of azure blood were flowing into the mud. What are they doing? Did they come to absorb the soul shards? Finally, the monsters reached the carcass. Each of them took one of the shards. However, instead of absorbing them, they simply turned around and carried the precious crystals away. The scavengers made way, following the shards with their little hungry eyes. Sunny blinked and looked at Nephis. Do we still leave now? Changing Star frowned and hesitated. A few moments later, she shook her head. No, we will go tomorrow. Then she turned west and observed the retreating monsters. Get your shadow to follow these two back. Because of the shadow fragments Sunny had absorbed in the last few days, the range of shadow control has increased a little. However, it was still far from being enough to explore deep into the labyrinth. He only got the general direction in which the two large monsters were moving. They were going west. After telling this to Nephis, there was pretty much nothing else for him to do. In the end, Sunny decided to simply rest. The next day was promising to be full of hardships and danger, so it was in his best interest to let his body recover as much as it could. Some time later, Sunny was lying on his back, staring at the gray sky. Cassie was sitting beside him, lost in her thoughts. Nephis was meditating. At least that's what it looked like. She might as well have been asleep for all Sunny knew. After a while, Cassie turned to him. "Sunny." He tilted his head to look at her. "Yeah." The blind girl hesitated. Do you think we will be able to return home?" Sunny glanced at her and furrowed his brow. A few seconds later, he turned away and looked at the sky again. "Sure." Cassie smiled. "You really think so? Why? What's with all these questions?" He sighed and tried to find the right words. "Because of her." He pointed at Nephis, knowing that Cassie won't see it. There was no one else on the stone platform, though, so it was pretty obvious who he was referring to. "I'm also not someone to die easily. In fact, I'm willing to bet that you couldn't have found a better duo of sleepers to escort you across the dream realm. If anyone can survive this, it's us. So yeah, I think that our chances of making it back are pretty high." Cassie suddenly giggled. "Aren't you a little too full of yourself? You were in the second to last place." Sunny shrugged. "That's only because someone smart told me to keep a low profile. Otherwise, I would have ranked higher." Then with a grin he added, "Much higher. Third to last at least." The blind girl couldn't help but laugh. The melodic sound of her laughter made Sunny feel much better. He had not heard anything like that ever since coming to the dream realm. It was nice to see that people were still able to preserve a bit of mirth, even in this hellish place. Come to think of it, this was the first time he heard Cassie laugh at all. Back in the academy, she was always dull and bleak. After this sudden outburst, Cassie's expression slowly turned wistful. A few seconds later, she asked, "What do you miss the most about home?" Sunny tried to think of something, but failed. He wasn't sure that he even had a home in the real world. The tiny room he had been renting previously was nothing but a temporary shelter from the rain. As for the real world as a whole, his life there wasn't that pleasant either. Finally, he said, "I don't particularly miss anything." Cassie was very surprised. "Really? Don't you miss your family?" Sunny smiled. "I don't have a family. Well, I guess I have a sister somewhere, but we haven't seen each other in many years." "Oh." The blind girl fell silent. Several seconds later, she said quietly, "I miss my family the most." There was longing and sadness in her voice. Sunny didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent. "Mom and Dad must be really worried about me right now." No, actually they wouldn't be worried. They would be heartbroken. They must think that I'm as well as dead already." Sunny glanced at her and sighed. "You seem to care about them a lot." Cassie turned to him in confusion. "Of course, isn't it normal?" Sunny stared at the gray sky. The wind smelled of rain. After a while he said, "I wouldn't know." In the evening, Nephis made Sunny perform the 1,000 strikes again. After that, they ate the last strips of dried scavenger meat and took turns sleeping, so that one of them could always keep an eye on Cassie. Thankfully, nothing happened during the night. When the morning came and the dark sea retreated, they prepared to leave the giant statue. Nephis was the first one to climb down. Before that, she had a few words to say. "Today will be different from before. There will be much more scavengers roaming in the labyrinth. We might not be able to create an ambush or avoid fighting several of them at once." She looked at Sunny. "If anything happens, your job is to bring Cassie away. We can retreat by using passages that are too narrow for the scavengers. If we get separated, proceed to the high point by yourselves. Don't wait for me. Do you understand?" With a somber expression, he gave her a nod. Nephis returned it. "Good. Time is of the essence, so let's go." With that, she began the descent. After Nephis reached a point 20 or so meters below them, She found purchase and waited. Using the golden rope, Sunny lowered Cassie down. Just like while climbing up, they took turns helping the blind girl. Luckily, climbing down the statue was much easier. Soon, they reached the ground. Entering the labyrinth, the trio moved forward with haste. The shadow was ahead of them, scouting for monsters and optimal paths. Despite that, their progress was slow and chaotic. They had to constantly change direction to avoid groups of scavengers, often ending up in dead ends or moving further away from their destination. Sunny, who played the role of the scout and navigator, felt his brain slowly starting to boil. At some point, however, they inevitably ended up in a situation where a fight was unavoidable. There was a large group of scavengers at their heels, and a pair of them blocking the path ahead. Neither of the two groups had noticed the sleepers yet. However, since there were no other passages to turn into, it was only a matter of time. Naphis considered their options for a few seconds. There was a scowl on her face. Finally, she said, "If there's only two, we can take them." Sunny looked at her with uncertainty in his eyes. But there's no time to set up an ambush. He wasn't quite sure how they could fight two scavengers at once. Despite how good of a teacher Naphis was, he only practiced with the sword for a day. Facing against a scavenger alone was risky. Changing Star shrugged. "It's almost the same. I will attack first. You follow behind in the shadows and finish one off once they turn. Then, we kill the second one together." The whole plan was based on the assumption that Naphis could survive under the onslaught of two scavengers, both attacking her simultaneously. Sunny was very impressed by her prowess, but he wasn't sure that it was possible. There was a large probability that Naphis would die. He still remembered that she wasn't present in Cassie's first vision. But what else could they do? A bit rattled, Sunny gritted his teeth. "All right." After a short pause, Naphis summoned her sword. Then she stepped forward. After finding a good hiding spot for Cassie, Sunny and Naphis proceeded forward to face the scavengers. Soon they saw two hulking silhouettes in the distance. With her lips pursed together, Naphis threw over her shoulder, "Keep up." Then, like a runner preparing for a race, she got down on one knee, inhaled deeply, and lunged forward. Damn! Sunny dove into the deep shadow cast by the wall of the labyrinth and followed, running as fast as he could. However, the distance between them kept growing. Suddenly, he remembered walking behind Naphis as they crossed the bridge to the academy. Was it his fate to always follow behind her? Changing Star's running speed was incredibly fast. She was practically flying through the air, like an arrow let loose from a bow. One of her arms was stretched backward, holding the sword with its point to the ground. The other was cutting the air with each stride. It took the two scavengers a couple of seconds to realize what was happening after noticing her. By that time, she was almost upon them, with madness burning in their eyes and viscous saliva dripping from their mandibles. The monsters screeched and charged forward. Naphis did not slow down, as though planning to ram them with her body. Sunny's heart skipped a bit. 4 terrifying pincers shot through the air. At the last moment, Naphis fell backward, falling on her side. The inertia carried her forward as she slid through the mud, passing between the scavengers. Then she twisted her body and stopped herself by plunging the sword into the ground. A bit slower and she would have been impaled by one of the scavengers' legs. Crazy, she's crazy. By the time Changing Star got back to her feet, one of the scavengers had already turned around. However, Sunny couldn't see what was going on, as his sight was blocked by the bulky carapace creatures. He only heard the sound of chitin striking against steel. There was no time to worry about that anyway, since he had his own problems to solve. Due to the insane maneuver that Naphis had pulled off, the second scavenger lagged a little behind the first one. It was just about to turn around when Sunny finally got close enough to launch an attack. Silently cursing, he ran up a narrow protrusion on the coral wall and jumped, aiming to pierce the weak point at the scavenger's back from above. His shadow was already wrapped around the azure blade, but at the last moment, the scavenger suddenly moved, slightly turning its torso to the right. The blade missed the concave spot where the armor plates connected, and instead hit one of them square in the center, sliding helplessly across adamantine chitin. Crap! Instead of killing the beast with one decisive blow, Sunny ended up dealing no damage at all. What's worse, he landed right on top of the scavenger, practically hugging it from behind. In the next moment, the scavenger shook its carapace, throwing the irritating human off. Sunny flew sideways and crashed into the labyrinth wall, feeling breath being knocked out of him. Suffocating and disoriented, he fell gracelessly into the mud. Not good. By some instinct, Sunny rolled to the side. Something tore past him and hit the wall, sending pieces of crimson coral flying through the air. Then he was lifted into the air and thrown backward. But by that time, however, he had already come to his senses. Twisting his body, Sunny managed to land on his feet and take a few steps back without falling. In the next second, his sword was in front of him, held in both hands just like Naphis had taught him. The scavenger was already charging at him with a menacing fire burning in its eyes. Repetition, experience. The shadow flowed from the azure blade to his hand, then spread to his arm, shoulder, and then finally covered his whole body. Sunny instantly felt stronger, faster, more resilient. But was it enough? No. To survive, he would definitely also need some luck. One pincer flew at him from the right, the other from the left. There was no time to retreat or dodge sideways. So instead, Sunny did something that made every instinct in his body scream in protest. He jumped forward, closing the distance to the charging monster. The pincers clashed together with a loud crack behind his back. Instinct or not, it was the only logical step. After all, the attack range of his sword was much shorter than that of the scavenger. He could only fight back by getting close. Before the beast had time to react, Sunny did what he had recently done thousands of times. His muscles moved even before his mind gave the command. With one fluid motion, he raised the sword over his head and slashed downward, pushing with one hand while pulling with the other. His whole body moved in concert to deliver a powerful blow. The azure blade whistled as it cut the air. Then it hit the joint of one of the scavenger's front legs and cleaved right through it, severing the limb entirely. Blue blood sprayed everywhere. Sunny had less than a second to be amazed. I actually did it. But there was no time to be distracted. Due to the loss of its front leg, the scavenger lost balance for a moment, careening forward and down. However, he had 7 other legs. This wasn't going to last long. Coincidentally, though, at this exact moment his other front leg slid in the mud, bringing the monster even further down. Sunny did not waste this chance. Taking a step forward, he thrust the azure blade up, pushing it into the scavenger's mouth. A severed mandible fell to the ground, as the monster impaled itself on the sword with its own weight. The massive body of the nightmare creature convulsed before falling still. It was dead. Sunny slowly exhaled, only now feeling the pain in his chest and at the back of his head. He carefully touched it and grimaced. His hand came back wet with blood. At least I'm alive. You have slain an awakened beast, carapace scavenger. Your shadow grows stronger. You have. With no time to listen to the spell, Sunny tugged on the sword to dislodge it from the monster's head and hurried to help Naphis. However, it was too late. The other scavenger was lying in the mud, clearly dead. His limbs were still twitching, indicating that the fatal blow was delivered just moments ago. It seemed like Naphis had managed to sever its spine by piercing the weak spot at the base of the beast's torso with her longsword. He couldn't see the silver-haired girl behind the bulky carcass. As Sunny approached it, he heard the sound of rugged, strained breathing. Then a shaky voice came from behind the scavenger. Don't come any closer. In the deathly silence of the battle's aftermath, Changing Star's voice sounded strange and subdued. Sunny suddenly felt as though someone had squeezed his heart in a fist. Steeling himself, he took another step forward. Naphis was standing in front of the dead scavenger, trying to catch her breath after the intense fight. There was a bloody gash on her shoulder. However, it didn't look life-threatening. Sunny's attention, though, was instantly drawn to something else. It seemed that at some point during the fight, the tall girl's makeshift seaweed top came apart, leaving her naked above the waist. She was covering her chest with one arm. Behind the arm squished the supple fullness of her. Sunny flinched as though someone had stung him and hurriedly turned around. His face was burning. Without thinking about it, he even made his shadow look away. An awkward silence followed. After some time, Sunny forced himself to speak. Are you all right? Nafis was slow to answer. Yes. Good, good, I will. I will go fetch Cassie then. All right. Feeling as though an army of monsters was chasing him, he walked forward on stiff legs and then quickened his step, barely holding himself from running. Her fault, it's her fault. She should have communicated things clearer. Trying to get the vivid image out of his head, Sunny hurried to the place where Cassie was waiting for them. By the time they returned, Nafis had already fixed her top and was wearing it as though nothing had happened. However, Sunny couldn't help but feel that the look she gave him was somewhat weird. Forget it. After checking the wound on his head, Changing Star said, "It's just a bleeder, nothing serious. Tell me if you feel dizzy and nauseous, or have a strong headache though." Since Sunny had none of these symptoms, he kept quiet. Nafis looked down at his clothes and sighed. Memory. He opened his mouth to say no, but then fell silent. Come to think of it, when he killed the scavenger, the spell did say something else, after informing him about the absorbed shadow fragments. At the time, he was too busy to pay it any attention. Let me check. He summoned runes and quickly found the cluster representing his memories. Silver Bell, Puppeteer's Shroud, Azure Blade. Nothing new. Then what was the spell talking about? Suddenly, he noticed a new set of runes in the neighboring cluster. His eyes widened. Echoes, Carapace Scavenger. Echo, it's an echo. Sunny couldn't believe his eyes. Echoes were an extremely rare type of reward that Awakened could receive after slaying nightmare creatures. Chances of getting one were very low. In the real world, an echo could be sold for an unimaginable amount of money. That's because they were much more precious than memories. Without delaying it much further, he dove into his sea of soul. There, very few things had changed. A lonely black sun was still hanging above the calm, silent waters. It was orbited by spheres of light that represented his memories. This time, there were 3 of them. Just like before, Sunny couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was stealthily moving just beyond the periphery of his vision. However, this time, he didn't pay it any attention. He wanted to see his echo. It too was represented by a sphere of light. However, this sphere was much larger and hovered further away from the shadow core. With a thought, he commanded it to descend. The sphere slowly floated down and touched the dark water. As Sunny came closer, walking on the surface of the sea, its radiance slowly faded away, revealing the monster contained within. A hulking, menacing carapace scavenger was calmly standing in front of him. There was no madness in its eyes, or any feeling at all for that matter. After all, it wasn't really alive. It was just an echo. Shining runes appeared in the air around the scavenger. Echo, Carapace Scavenger. Echo type, Beast. Echo core, Awakened, Strong, Armored. Echo description: a cursed soldier of the Fallen Legion. Before Sunny knew it, a wide grin appeared on his face. That scavenger was now his. It could be summoned and used to fight against his enemies, carry heavy cargo, or perform other tasks. What's more, it was a whole rank above its master, which meant that it was much stronger, more resilient and fearsome than a dreamer with a dormant core should normally possess. With this echo by their side, many things would become easier. Following an impulse, Sunny raised a hand and brushed it against cold, black chitin. He just wanted to touch his new possession. However, the moment his palm touched the scavenger, a strange thing happened. The soul of sea suddenly surged a little, and a new set of runes appeared. Transform Echo into a shadow. Sunny flinched and snatched his hand back. What the hell is that about? He had never heard anything about transforming echoes into something else, let alone shadows. Then again, he had never heard about shadow cores and fragments too. It seems my aspect holds more secrets than I thought. Sunny licked his lips and hesitated. Then he cautiously said, yes. However, nothing happened. A moment later, the runes changed. Not enough shadow fragments to perform a transformation. Shadow fragments required 24 out of 100. He frowned, disappointed. I see. So there is another use for the fragments. They can either enhance my own core, or do something weird to echoes. How do I know which use is more beneficial? without knowing what a transformation actually does. An echo was plenty useful by itself. Sunny felt that it would be wiser to concentrate on strengthening himself, at least for now. I will experiment with it later. With that, he left the Sea of Soul. Since he had spaced out for quite a bit, Nephis was looking at him with a silent question in her eyes. Sunny grinned. I got an echo. Her pupils slightly widened. Cassie, on the other hand, was more expressive. An echo. You actually got an echo? Yes, since the larger group of monsters was now minutes away from catching up with them. Sunny didn't waste any time and summoned the scavenger. The hulking beast immediately appeared in front of him, seemingly sewn together from tiny sparks of light. Soon, its black chitin became fully corporeal. Following Sunny's command, it shifted a little and raised its mighty pincers. Nephis observed the echo with an unreadable expression. Then, a corner of her lips slightly curled up. Good. Sunny looked at her with a smile. I think we can task it with carrying Cassie. Outside of battle, it will help us the most. The blind girl's mouth fell open. Carry me like a mount. He chuckled and slapped the scavenger on its carapace. This bad boy can fit a petite girl like you with no problem at all. Trust me, I've been clambering these things a lot for the past few days. It's actually quite spacious on top of them, especially if they're not trying to kill you. Cassie hesitated. Well, okay, if you think it's for the best. Sunny and Nephis helped the blind girl to climb on top of the echo. Then they used the golden rope to create makeshift reins for Cassie to hold onto. After quickly retrieving soul shards from the dead scavengers, the sleepers hastily left the passage, narrowly avoiding another battle. With Cassie riding comfortably atop the scavenger, their overall speed dramatically increased. Sunny and Nephis were jogging in the front, hoping to recoup the time lost in the first half of the day and reach the high point with an hour or two to spare. From time to time, they had to take detours to avoid fighting groups of carapace monsters. However, with a monster of their own by their side, the mood and mental state of the three sleepers were much better. For the first time since coming to this place, Sunny felt somewhat calm. Of course, this calmness didn't last long. At some point, he noticed that the wind had picked up a bit. Almost simultaneously, Cassie asked them to stop. Nephis and Sunny looked at her with deep frowns. It seemed that they both had a bad premonition. What is it? The blind girl let go of the reins. Do you hear anything? They looked at each other, then shook their heads. No, why? Cassie scowled. Help me get off this thing. After they helped her, she stood motionless for a while, listening. Her scowl deepened. Then the blind girl cautiously kneeled and put her ear to the ground. What do you hear? Cassie licked her lips. It's murmuring. Suddenly, a drop of water fell on Sunny's face. He raised his head and looked at the sky. There, dark, stormy clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. Pretty soon, they were bound to cover it completely, including the sun. And when that happened, his eyes widened. We need to move now. As Nephis turned to him, Sunny grabbed Cassie and helped her stand up. His face was even paler than usual, and there was a panicked look in his eyes. Now, help me get her back on the scavenger. The silver-haired girl raised her head and looked at the sky. Soon, her expression darkened. Without saying anything, she did as he had asked. Cassie seemed a bit disoriented. She grabbed the reins and helplessly turned to her friend. Neph, what is going on? Changing Star glanced at her. When she eventually spoke, her voice sounded heavy. A storm is coming. Meanwhile, Sunny sent his shadow to climb on top of a tall pillar of coral and looked ahead, trying to understand how far the cliffs they were aiming for were. From the look of it, there was still a considerable distance to go. However, the giant statue was already much further away. Going back now would have been suicide. He turned to Nephis. We're about 3 or 4 kilometers away from the cliffs. Do you think we can make it? She scowled. If we take the most direct route, maybe. Sunny hesitated, then asked, what about the monsters? Changing Star looked ahead and gritted her teeth. We will have to cut through. That's it, that's the plan. As he was fruitlessly trying to come up with some devious trick to save them, Nephis turned her head and glanced at him, puzzled. What are you waiting for? Run. As they darted forward, Heavy drops of rain were starting to fall on the ground. Strong winds were howling between the coral blades, sending bits of mud and seaweed flying. With storm clouds gathering in the sky, sunlight dimmed, and a cold twilight descended upon the labyrinth. Sunny was running with all his might, as though his life depended on it, because it actually did. He was leading their small group, choosing the straightest path toward the cliffs with the help of his shadow. Nephis was a step behind him. The scavenger carrying Cassie was stomping through the mud with its 8 legs in the back. Without the need to avoid monsters and death breathing down their necks, they moved with amazing speed. Side passages and crimson walls were flashing past them in a blur. There was no need to hold back and conserve strength for the long run. If they were late to reach the cliffs by a minute, their lives would be over. They had to give it their all. Sunny was ready to fight a series of bloody skirmishes all along the way, but to his surprise, the inhabitants of the labyrinth did not give them much trouble. The scavengers seemed to be as panicked as they were. The bulky beasts were busy trying to hide inside the coral mounds or burrowing underground. On the rare occasions when one of them showed aggression, a quick slash of the sword or a threatening clack of a pincer was enough to make the monster change its mind. However, no matter how fast they were moving, the storm was faster. The rain quickly turned into a pelting downpour, each drop becoming a torrent. The winds grew in strength, striking against their bodies with enough force to make them stumble. The light dimmed even further, reducing visibility to almost zero. Finally, a blinding bolt of lightning tore through the darkness, followed almost immediately by a deafening thunderclap. In the next moment, the ground under Sunny's feet trembled, causing him to lose balance and fall. He rolled in the mud and tried to stand up, but slipped and fell again. Someone's arm grabbed him by the shoulder and helped him rise. In the darkness of the storm, Sunny saw Changing Star's face. She opened her mouth and shouted, "Don't stop, run." He almost couldn't hear her behind the roaring wind and rain. By the time Sunny began to move, the dark, salty water was already as high as his shins. He gritted his teeth. The sea was coming back. He couldn't determine where the water was coming from, but with each minute it was rising higher. Soon it was up to his knee, then up to his waist, making running almost impossible. The speed of the group slowed down considerably. It was then, in a sudden flash of lightning, when they saw a dark mass of stone ahead. They had made it to the cliffs. Almost at the same time, a terrible rumbling sound came from the depths of the labyrinth. Turning back, Sunny saw a colossal, crushing torrent of black water rushing through the crimson forest. Some distance away, a tardy scavenger was caught by it and thrown against the coral walls. The unbreakable carapace of the mighty creature cracked and burst open like a rotten egg. Curses! He turned to Nephis. "Time is up, start climbing." She caught him by the arm. "Dismiss your echo." Sunny didn't know whether the scavenger could scale the cliff. In any case, Cassie wouldn't have been able to hold on if it did. He helped the blind girl get down, and then sent the monster back to the Sea of Soul. Nephis lowered herself to let Cassie climb on her back, then tied them together with the golden rope. Not wasting any time, she gritted her teeth and stepped forward to grab onto the wet rocks of the cliff wall. They began the ascent, rushing to get as high as possible before the black torrent hit. Some time later, Sunny screamed, "Brace!" In the next moment, a wall of dark water hit the rocks mere meters beneath their feet. As Sunny held for dear life, the whole cliff shuddered. A few boulders fell from somewhere high above, missing his head only by chance. Somehow, all 3 of them were still alive. However, things were far from being over. The black water was still rising, now with frightening speed, threatening to swallow them at any second. They had to keep climbing, and they had to be faster than the surging sea. Sunny cursed as he searched for the next hold to grab onto. To survive, he had to scale the face of the cliff with crazy speed. However, hastily climbing wet rocks was a recipe for disaster. One slip of a hand, and he would plunge down to be crushed against the cliffs, drown, or be eaten by some giant monster. The torrential rain and hurricane wind made everything even worse. And yet, there was no choice. He frantically kept climbing, tearing his skin on sharp rocks. Every muscle in his body was in agony. If not for the shadow wrapped tightly around his body, Sunny would have been long dead, but even with its help, the surging dark water was getting closer and closer. Damn it all. No matter how hard Sunny tried, he couldn't win back any distance. Soon, the water was at his feet. The sea slowly swallowed his legs, then his torso. He kept climbing, now fighting against the weight of the water and the force of the tide that was trying to tear him away from the cliff. But it was useless in the end. When the water covered his shoulders, he felt his fingers slipping from the wet rocks. Sunny tried to hold on, but the current was too strong. He was pushed away like a weightless toy, losing any purchase. No. In the last second, a golden rope fell into the water beside him. Shaken, Sunny grabbed onto it and held with all his strength. The rope drew tight and lifted him out of the water. His feet touched the cliff wall again. Not wasting any time, he resumed climbing with the help of the rope. Finally, a strong hand grabbed him from above and dragged his body over the edge of the cliff. Sunny fell to the ground, struggling to breathe. After some time, he looked at Nephis, who was lying in a similar position to his right, equally as drained. She was still clutching the golden rope in her hand. Cassie was sitting a few steps away from them. He wanted to laugh but had no strength for it. They survived. For a few minutes, Sunny simply lay on the ground, letting the rain hit his face. From time to time, a bolt of lightning arced through the skies, drowning everything in blinding light. Other than that, it was almost completely dark. If not for his attribute, he would have had trouble discerning the shapes of Nephis and Cassie, who were resting nearby. After some time, however, a feeling of uneasiness entered his mind. Something was off. Sunny scowled, trying to understand where that feeling was coming from. Finally, he realized that it was his shadow. It was trying to draw his attention to something. "Please, let me rest. I just want to rest." He was too tired to do anything. Both his body and mind were exhausted. However, the shadow was very persistent. It remained adamant. In the end, Sunny moaned and rolled over on his stomach, then slowly stood up. Nephis turned her head and looked at him. "What is it?" He grimaced. "I don't know yet, something feels wrong." Cassie shivered and got closer to Neph. Following his shadow's warning, Sunny looked around, trying to find any sign of danger in their surroundings. Even with his vision, he couldn't see anything out of place. The upper part of the cliffs was well above the stormy sea, forming a small island. Its surface was rugged and uneven, with several protruding ridges breaking the line of sight. There was a large space between their group and the nearest ridge. That space was littered, seemingly at random, with piles of dirt and tall boulders. Nephis got up and summoned her sword. "Do you see anything?" Sunny frowned. "Not really." At that moment, another lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the small island. His eyes widened. The tall boulders surrounding them were massive and irregularly shaped. They were black in color and motionless. That's why Sunny had not recognized them for what they were at first glance. All around them, scavengers were silently lying on the ground. Sunny froze, suddenly consumed by terror. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled and stood up on ends. 1, 2, 3. He lost count because of panic and gritted his teeth. 7, no, 8 of them. It seemed the 3 humans were not the only ones who thought of taking shelter from the dark sea on these cliffs. He trembled. These cliffs were a death trap. Noticing something on his face, Nephis tensed. "Sunny." He slowly turned his head to her and whispered, "Don't speak. Don't move. Just stay where you are." She followed his instructions without asking for the reason. However, a silent question appeared on her face. Cassie did the same. Sunny closed his eyes and breathed in, trying to calm his panicking mind down. There were no hopeless situations. Every problem had a solution. He just had to think of one. The scavengers did not attack yet. Maybe they were asleep or patiently waiting out the storm, trying not to move in fear of attracting more terrifying monsters. Maybe they simply did not notice the humans. After all, it was unknown how well these creatures could see. Were they able to see in the dark? Probably not, or at least not as well as he could. There was still hope. Sunny opened his eyes and looked at the small island again. But this time, his perspective was different. He saw the deep darkness, the clamor of the storm that drowned out most of the sounds, the large distance between the scavenger. This was his territory. It was perfectly suited for a murderous shadow. Didn't he dream of becoming a silent assassin? Well, here was his chance. He just had to execute each step perfectly. Crawl through the darkness, strike without alerting the enemy, kill each of them with one precise blow, rinse and repeat. He already knew their strengths and weaknesses. All that was left was to put that knowledge to practice. And even if he makes a mistake, there were other means to fall back onto. Echo and Naphis could do their part if he were to land himself in danger. Yes, that could work. It had to. Sunny looked at Changing Star and Cassie. I will take care of this. Before they could react, he seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Under the cover of darkness, Sunny sneaked forward. His steps were soft and measured, his breathing controlled. He quickly determined the optimal order of attack to minimize the chance of being discovered, and proceeded to the first target, a hulking scavenger that was the furthest away from the pack. Hidden in the shadows, Sunny suddenly felt calm and focused. He felt as though he was finally in his natural element. As the looming silhouette of the scavenger approached, he slowed down and circled around his target. The monster did not move, oblivious to the lurking threat that was drawing closer with each second. Sunny held his breath and prepared to attack. He only had one chance. Do it right. With that thought, he silently lunged forward. One step, two. Sunny jumped and easily landed on the monster's carapace. The azure blade was already in his hand, its steel dark. A moment later, it plunged into the weak point on the scavenger's back, piercing the chitin and destroying its brain. The quiet crack of the breaking carapace was quickly washed away by the rain. It was done. Sunny felt a sense of triumph appear in his heart and quickly suppressed it. This wasn't the right time to celebrate. 7 targets were still waiting for him in the darkness. He retrieved his sword and jumped down from the scavenger's corpse. Then Sunny frowned. Why was the spell silent? It didn't announce his kill, nor the absorption of the shadow fragments. Feeling his skin crawl, Sunny turned around and looked at the scavenger. At first he was afraid that the beast was still alive, but that wasn't the case. It was as dead as could be. However, on closer inspection, Sunny noticed something that he had missed before. And when he did, his face paled. The scavenger was dead. However, it wasn't Sunny's blade that killed it. While circling the target, he was focused on staying unnoticed and not alerting the enemy to his presence before reaching the optimal position for an attack. After that, he only saw the monster's back. That's why he didn't notice the terrible wound that ran from the top of the creature's torso to its segmented legs. Obscured by the rain, the unbreakable carapace was cut open like a tin can. The scavenger's flesh and mangled organs could be easily seen through the large gap, oozing azure blood. It streamed down only to be washed away by the storm. Sunny gulped. He might have felt awkward about performing a perfect ambush on a long-dead monster, if not for the fear of whatever had killed it in the first place. Looking around, he hesitated and summoned the azure blade back, then wrapped himself in the shadow. The small island was silent, except for the howling of the wind. The rain was still falling down, forming a constant veil that hid away all details and distant objects. A rare flash of lightning sometimes flooded this bleak world with stark whiteness. Then, a thunderclap would come, making the skies tremble. With cold fright settling deep into his bones, Sunny cautiously moved to the next scavenger. He could tell from some distance that it was also dead, but had to come closer and make sure. Indeed, he was right. The creature was almost severed in half by the unknown assailant. Its wet innards were lying on the ground in a messy pile. The darkness had long ago stopped being comforting, becoming terrifying and oppressive instead. Sunny shivered. By the time he checked on all 8 monsters and confirmed that they were all dead, he was nauseous and scared out of his wits. When Sunny had first realized that the black shapes were, in fact, scavengers, he thought that the situation was as bad as it could get. Now he wasn't sure anymore. In fact, he was pretty convinced that things went from bad to worse. Standing near the last scavenger, Sunny observed his surroundings and thought about returning to Neff and Cassie. Maybe the terrifying killer had already left the island. They could just hide and hope for the best. He wouldn't be alone, at least. However, not knowing what kind of danger was hiding in the darkness would drive him insane, long before the morning came. Plus, with his fated attribute, hoping for the best was a fool's errand. That's why, although his body was covered in cold sweat, Sunny gritted his teeth and slowly walked toward the ridge that was obscuring the rest of the island from him. Coming close, he started climbing, trying to be as quiet as possible. The ridge wasn't very high, so he was able to scale it without much effort. Sticking close to the rocks, he raised his head a look down. Then, he immediately wanted to let go and fall to the ground. Right beneath him, just a few meters away, a dark silhouette was outlined against the rocks. It was much larger than the scavengers, with jagged spikes growing out of its thick carapace. Its chitin was black and crimson, like an ancient armor splattered with fresh blood. Instead of pincers, two terrifying bone scythes were protruding from the joints of its arms. Each one was long and sharp enough to split a scavenger in two. Sunny froze, afraid to move. He even stopped breathing. So that's the killer. It was one of those monsters that they had seen retrieving the transcendent soul shard from the giant shark's carcass, or another of their kind. He remembered how the two creatures had cut through the horde of scavengers, killing or throwing aside any beast that got in their way. Slaughtering just 7 of them would not pose a problem for something that deadly. Not to mention getting rid of 3 sleepers. Careful not to make a sound, Sunny slowly lowered himself down. His whole body was trembling. Moving his arms and legs with utmost precision, he began climbing down from the ridge, praying not to be heard, sensed, or noticed in some other way. Luckily, the monster remained oblivious to his presence. Reaching the ground, Sunny took a few steps back, still facing the ridge. He had to force himself to turn around, feeling as though his back was being pierced by invisible needles. The young man stealthily moved in the direction where he had left his companions. A couple of minutes later, he returned to Nephis and Cassie. The girls were tense and nervous, waiting for his return in the darkness. Before coming out of the shadows, Sunny let them know that he was approaching. "It's me." Nephis moved, lowering her sword a little. Her face was a little grim. "What is the situation?" she said, careful to keep her voice low. Sunny slowly exhaled, finally feeling a bit safer. For the first time, he was genuinely happy not to be alone in this cursed place. "There are 8 scavengers around us, but they are all dead. The killer is one of those big monsters we saw, the thing with the crimson pattern on its carapace and scythes instead of pincers. It's hiding from the storm beneath a stone ridge not far from here." A bolt of lightning flashed, illuminating everything around. In its aftermath, it looked as though 2 white sparks ignited in Changing Star's eyes. Soon the reflection was gone, leaving them gray and inscrutable again. She tilted her head and whispered, as though talking to herself. "An awakened monster." Sunny licked his lips. "Yeah, so what should we do?" Nephis thought for a while, leaning on her sword. Then she looked at him and said, "Kill it." Sunny stared at her, lost for words. Finally, he collected himself and said the first thing that came to his mind. "Are you nuts?" The idea of fighting that thing was pretty ridiculous, if not completely insane. Realizing that his words might have sounded a bit rude, he cleared his throat and added, "I mean, have you thought this through? How are we supposed to kill that monstrosity?" Nephis slowly inhaled. "It's not a question of thinking things through. We simply have no choice." She glanced at Cassie, who was listening to them with a pale face, and explained, "We can't leave the cliffs before morning, and neither can the monster. However, once the sun rises, it will easily see us and attack. Then, our only advantage, the element of surprise, will be gone. If we have to fight it anyway, it's better to be the ones initiating the fight." Changing Star looked around and added, "It's not completely dark yet, although barely I can still see. Once the night comes, that won't be the case. So we will have to attack it first and do it soon." Sunny shook his head. "This still doesn't explain how we are going to kill it. That thing just dispatched 8 scavengers like it was nothing. We are not its opponents. We don't even know its weaknesses." Nephis frowned. After a short pause, she said, "It's just an awakened monster." Sunny couldn't help but stare at her in disbelief. "What do you mean, just an awakened monster? Have you forgotten that all 3 of us are only sleepers? Dormant humans are not supposed to be able to deal with awakened beasts let alone monsters. The fact that we can reliably kill scavengers is already abnormal. She looked back at him, undisturbed, and simply answered, "But we are abnormal." Sonny stood there with his mouth open, not knowing what to say. Nafis sighed. "You and I both are not exactly ordinary sleepers, aren't we? Don't try and deny it. Someone ordinary simply would not have survived in this place." He frowned, not happy about her line of thought. Meanwhile, Changing Star continued. "You, me, plus the awakened beast you have as an echo, plus the advantage of a surprise attack. I'm not saying that it will be easy. We might die, but there's a good chance that we won't." She looked down at the silvery blade of her sword, and added after a couple of seconds, "In any case, as I have already said, we don't have a choice." Sonny gritted his teeth, trying to find a logical retort. However, her reasoning seemed unassailable. He just had a really bad feeling about fighting that monster. In the ensued silence, Cassie, who had been quiet all this time, suddenly spoke. "You are forgetting about the main advantage we have over that thing." Both of them looked at her, surprised. The blind girl turned to face them and slightly lifted her head. "We are intelligent, and the monster is not." Her words echoed in the darkness. Sonny sighed. It seemed that a fight with the bone scythe monster was inevitable. Some time later, he was standing in the darkness, looking at the terrifying creature in front of him. His expression was grim and somber. Tightly gripping the azure blade, Sonny slowly inhaled. The ominous feeling he had before was still there, now stronger than ever. "I don't like this." With this thought, he exhaled and raised his hand.